Carlo Gambino was 66 years old and still standing. That alone said something. He had outlived the men who came before him and the men who tried to control him. Vincent Mangano was dead by April 1951 at 63. Albert Anastasia had gone down in a barber's chair in 1957 at 55. Frank Scalise was killed at 63. Lucky Luciano died in 1962 at 64. Power in New York was never permanent. It was rented, and the rent was paid in blood. Around Gambino, the next tier was aging too. Agnello della Croce was 54, respected, feared, old school to the bone. Paul Castellano was 53 and rising fast. Carmine Fatico was 58 in 1968. Joseph Nicholas Gallo was 58. Time was tightening around all of them. Gambino understood something the others didn't. Survival wasn't about muscle anymore. It was about transition. He needed a successor, and he needed to start grooming him before the choice was made for him by bullets, indictments, or a hospital bed. By the late 1960s, he was already making that decision. The streets were changing. Narcotics brought money, but they brought noise, wiretaps, informants, headlines. Gambino wanted distance from that. The future wasn't in corner social clubs. It was in real estate, finance, money laundering, stock manipulation, Wall Street contacts, sex services, international import-export, especially Italian goods like olive oil and cheese, and quiet relationships inside banks. The straight rackets were still gold. Control the unions and you control the pension funds. Control the pension funds and you influence construction, trucking, shipping, big business itself. That was power that didn't need a gun in its waistband. Della Croce wasn't built for that world. He believed in visibility, in presence, in the family being felt on the streets. He trusted soldiers more than stockbrokers. Gambino respected him, but he knew that kind of leadership belonged to another era. America itself was shifting. The old underworld networks were no longer operating in shadows alone. Las Vegas was under heat. Their entire skimming operation had been exposed in the pages of Life magazine. J. Edgar Hoover had known about the skim since the mid-1950s and kept his distance, but exposure changes the equation. Once it's printed nationwide, there's no pretending it isn't there. Meyer Lansky had to be brought back into focus, pushed to tighten control over individual casinos. Chicago and New Orleans stood beside him, reconstructing and refining the skim. Hotels and hospitality in America were being cornered. Expansion was stretching into Europe, South America, and the Caribbean. The profits had to diversify or they would dry up. Gambino saw it clearly. The future boss had to understand white-collar crime better than street crime. He had to know a boardroom as well as a backroom. Castellano fit that outline. He wasn't a flamboyant killer. He was methodical, practical. His ties to the relatives of Frank Scalise gave him legitimacy inside the family. Blood still mattered. So did alliances. Under him, the Roy DeMeo and Nino Gaggi crew built a reputation as one of the most feared and efficient outfits in America. Cold, disciplined, lethal. With men like that in the shadows, few would dare challenge Castellano's authority. Gambino himself was under pressure. His health was failing. Federal scrutiny was tightening. The only reason he avoided certain committee hearings was a doctor's certificate. Heart trouble. The last time he was sworn in before a committee, he suffered a heart attack. That kept him out of hearing rooms, but it wouldn't keep prosecutors away forever. New York had never been untouchable. Since the days of Thomas E. Dewey and Fiorello LaGuardia, through the televised crusades of Estes Kefauver and John L. McClellan, the Mafia had been a public target. Luciano himself had done 10 years. Vito Genovese was in prison. Joe Adonis had been deported. Frank Costello was retired after an attempted assassination. The New York offices of the FBI never stopped circling. Other families were weakening. The The Bonanza crew was exposed and vulnerable. The Colombo family was fracturing. The Genovese family had turned inward, quieter, more mysterious, harder to read. Instability creates opportunity, but it also creates risk. Gambino understood both. He knew the next man couldn't just command loyalty with fear. He had to insulate the family from federal heat. He had to move profits into legitimate channels. He had to look like a businessman first and a boss second. Gambino made his choice. The future of the family would not belong to the loudest gun. It would belong to the man who understood contracts, corporations, and capital. His name was Paul Castellano. In 1954, Calogero Vizzini died. With him went the last illusion that Sicily had a single, unquestioned patriarch. Unlike America, there was never a permanent boss of all Sicily. Power was divided. Provinces ruled themselves. Palermo mattered most, and inside Palermo, influence shifted through alliances, not coronations. Then came June 30th, 1963. An Alfa Romeo Giulietta sat in Ciaculli, a suburb of Palermo, packed with explosives. An anonymous phone call brought police and army officers to inspect it. The car detonated. 7 officers died in the blast. Salvatore Greco, Ciascitedu, was the intended target. He chaired the Sicilian Mafia Commission and led the Ciaculli family. According to turncoat Tommaso Buscetta, the bombing was orchestrated by rival boss Michele Cavataio, who wanted to frame the La Barbera faction and pour gasoline on the first Mafia war. The bomb missed its mark. Instead, it detonated something bigger. Italy turned on the Mafia. Within days, the government launched its first serious post-war crackdown. Nearly 2,000 suspected mobsters were arrested. On July 6, 1963, the first anti-mafia commission was formed. The internal war stopped being a private Sicilian affair and became open conflict with the state. The trial of the 114 followed. The original commission, the cupola, was dissolved. Bosses disappeared into hiding. By the late 1960s, most of the big trials collapsed for lack of evidence. Witnesses recanted, files thinned out. The Mafia did what it always did. It reorganized quietly. In the early 1970s, a new commission emerged. The violence dropped, the business grew, and the business was heroin. One figure rose to dominate Palermo's direction, not as a dictator, but as a chairman after the commission was restructured. Gaetano Badalamenti, boss of Sinisi. He became central to the heroin pipeline flowing toward the United States. Sicily wasn't ruled by one man, but Badalamenti chaired the board. The pipeline was efficient, morphine base from Turkey, refined in laboratories in Marseille, moved through Sicily, distributed by American Cosa Nostra families. This was the axis between Palermo and New York. In 1962, Lucky Luciano died outside Naples airport. His death left more than a vacuum. Luciano had acted as a bridge, tempering disputes between Sicilian factions and their American counterparts. Through his cousins and contacts, networks were stabilized at a time when Washington was turning its gaze toward Italy and Sicily. The Kennedy administration pressured Italy to accept deported gangsters. At first, Italy resisted. Their mafia had reorganized into something powerful, embedded in business and politics. But the flow resumed. The old order, men like Vito Genovese, had laid foundations through wartime black markets and post-war reconstruction. By the 1960s, corruption in Sicily reached deep into political and commercial structures. American money flooded Italy. Strategic interests demanded protection. The Mafia provided it. The old-school mafiosi were evolving. They were becoming white-collar brokers, using street soldiers as enforcement arms for business interests. Carlo Gambino understood the shift. He had always claimed to be against narcotics. If a made man was caught dealing, the sentence was death. But the key word was caught. If the bosses didn't know, and if the dealers weren't formally made, loopholes opened, rackets were disappearing. In the 1930s, the ice racket had printed millions when refrigeration didn't exist. The Mafia controlled the movement of ice blocks across New York. Refrigerators erased that overnight. Technology killed the need for gambling messengers. Automation cut manpower. Some men grew richer, others were pushed out. Narcotics filled the gap. It didn't matter whether you were Bonanno, Lucchese, or Gambino. Everyone had exposure. Heroin moved quietly, but earned heavily. And once you touched it, you became vulnerable. Not just to the Narcotics Bureau, but to multiple federal agencies at once. By the early 1970s, the new Sicilian Commission was less theatrical. Violence decreased. Profits increased. The product was heroin. And it connected Palermo directly to Brooklyn. Officially, Operation Gladio was a NATO stay-behind network, designed to resist a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. Unofficially, it operated in the shadows of black markets that had existed since the war. There was never going to be a Red Army landing in Palermo. But the infrastructure built to fight that possibility became something else, a channel for money, influence, and leverage. Narcotics money flowed through the same corridors used by intelligence networks. When Genovese ran black market operations in post-war Sicily, high-ranking generals and military officials took kickbacks. Corruption wasn't theoretical, it was transactional. After Genovese was deported, those corridors didn't vanish. They were repurposed. Gladio-linked structures intersected with existing criminal pipelines. Funds needed to move quietly. Narcotics did that better than any state budget. Luciano had once said the narcotics trade survived because too many people had a vested interest in its survival. The flow told the story. Morphine base from Turkey. Turkish networks facilitating movement. Refinement through Corsican labs in Marseille. Sicilian distribution hubs in Palermo. American families taking delivery. Every major organization touching the pipeline had, at some point, intelligence connections, direct or indirect. That didn't mean every shipment was sanctioned. It meant the corridors were known. The narcotics trade became more than organized crime. It became a parallel economy. In 1962, Robert F. Kennedy exposed what would later be known as the pizza connection. Heroin trafficking routed through seemingly legitimate businesses. The pressure reached the top of the narcotics bureaucracy. Harry J. Anslinger stepped down, choosing resignation over dismissal. The old guard was shaken. So was the intelligence establishment, where men like Alan Dulles preferred exit to humiliation. Kennedy intended to return to the White House. In 1968, he was assassinated. His campaign ended. The networks he attacked did not. The business continued. Carlo Gambino saw Sicily not just as a narcotics hub, but as an economic frontier. Tourism was rising. Olive oil, cheese, wine, traditional industries were expanding. Import-export channels offered camouflage and profit. Legitimate goods moved alongside counterfeit products. Merchandise stolen in America was shipped back to Sicily. Counterparts sold it for profit. Influence followed. But Gambino was realistic. He couldn't control Sicily. The families there would continue to feud. Chaos was part of the soil. Behind those families stood bankers and businessmen who had operated since the fall of Benito Mussolini. Men in suits, not social clubs. Relationships extended into financial institutions and even through corridors brushing against the Vatican. The Gambino family built ties into that world. They were becoming power players in Sicily. Not rulers, not untouchable, but connected. The family was evolving from a street syndicate into a transatlantic business network. Violence had not disappeared. It had simply been subordinated to profit. And in both Palermo and New York, the real power was no longer the man with the gun. It was the man who understood the system behind it. When power gets too visible, it doesn't apologize. It recalculates. In the 1970s, the heroin map was simple enough to draw with a finger across a globe. Morphine base out of Turkey, refined in the laboratories of Marseille, routed through Palermo, shipped onward to the United States. Cash came back the other way, boxed, laundered, redistributed. Sicily reorganized after the early 1960s crackdowns. The old commission fractured, then quietly rebuilt. Violence cooled, business sharpened. The product was heroin. Men like Gaetano Badalamenti sat at the center of that world. Not flamboyant, not theatrical, calculating. By the late 1970s, he was in exile, pushed out during internal wars that reshaped the Sicilian hierarchy. But exile didn't erase his name. It magnified it. Then came the American reckoning. In Manhattan, a federal courtroom filled with 22 defendants, 22 lawyers, translators, marshals, and enough paper to suffocate a city block. Anonymous jurors escorted by federal protection, 55,000 wiretaps, years of surveillance compressed into binders and transcripts. The government called it the biggest Mafia narcotics case ever brought to trial. The press called it the pizza connection. The theory was sprawling but direct. Sicilian-born operators, many working through pizzerias and food businesses across the East Coast and Midwest, formed a joint enterprise to import and distribute massive quantities of heroin. Money was collected in cash, boxed, and moved through European contacts and secret accounts. No checks, no bank trails, just a system. The legal weapon was RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which allowed prosecutors to argue that scattered players were in fact components of one criminal organism. Presiding over it was Judge Pierre N. Leval. Among the prosecutors was Louis Free. The government's star witness was Tommaso Buscetta, the first high-level Sicilian defector to describe the Mafia's internal structure in open court. Buscetta spoke of commissions, alliances, betrayals. He explained how wars inside Sicily had reshaped the balance of power. He detailed how heroin became central to survival. The defense insisted something else, that timing mattered, that the man at the center had been forced out before heroin dominance solidified. That association was not proof. That ambition could distort prosecution. The jury listened for nearly a year. When the verdict came down in 1987, Badalamenti and most of his co-defendants were found guilty. He was sentenced to decades in federal prison. It looked like a decapitation of the old transatlantic heroin pipeline. But pipelines don't die. They reroute. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The Cold War shifted terrain. Afghanistan had grown opium for generations, but war transformed cultivation into currency. Armed factions needed funding. Smuggling networks adapted quickly. Production surged. As the conflict deepened, Afghanistan became the dominant source of the world's opium. By the late 20th century, the majority of global heroin traced back to Afghan poppy fields. Western intelligence agencies funneled resources into the region to counter Soviet expansion. Weapons moved, money moved, political alliances formed. Counter-narcotics was not the priority. Stability and strategic positioning were. The heroin economy did not disappear. It expanded. European markets absorbed Afghan supply. Italian networks adjusted distribution lines. The geography shifted east. The economics remained constant. After 2001, when the United States returned militarily to Afghanistan, cultivation rebounded again. Poppy fields flourished in areas where governance was weak and survival depended on crop value. Opium remained Afghanistan's most profitable export. And while Afghan heroin saturated global routes, something else was unfolding inside the United States, not through smugglers, but through pharmacies. Prescription opioids entered mainstream medicine in the mid-1990s with unprecedented marketing force. The company most associated with that expansion was Purdue Pharma, owned by members of the Sackler family. OxyContin was presented as a breakthrough in pain management. Sales representatives reassured physicians about addiction risks. Distribution widened. Revenues soared. Unlike street heroin, these opioids were legal, regulated, and manufactured under license. But dependency spread across working-class towns, suburbs, and rural counties. Overdose deaths multiplied. Litigation followed. States sued. Settlements were negotiated. Corporate structures absorbed the shock. Two different systems operated in parallel. One illegal, one legal. One prosecuted under RICO with anonymous juries and wiretaps. One litigated through civil courts and bankruptcy proceedings. Yet the outcomes converged. For decades, narcotics money moved from unstable regions into Western cities through criminal syndicates. During an era when Afghanistan became the dominant global opium source amid war and foreign intervention, the United States experienced the worst drug epidemic in its history, fueled not only by heroin, but by mass-produced pharmaceutical opioids. The actors changed. The structure endured. When the French connection was exposed, routes shifted to Sicily. When Sicily was indicted, supply shifted toward Afghanistan. When heroin crackdowns intensified, synthetic and prescription opioids filled the void. At every stage, exposure triggered adaptation. And when megatrials grew so large they threatened to overwhelm the courts, federal judges, such as Jack B. Weinstein, warned that mass prosecutions risked guilt by confusion, straining juries, attorneys, and the system itself. The machinery never stops turning. It evolves. From dock workers in Marseille to pizzerias in Brooklyn. From poppy fields in Helmand to pill mills in Appalachia. From coded phone calls to marketing strategies. The flags change, the rhetoric changes, the paperwork changes, the flow remains. In the 1950s, US Steel was doing roughly $4 billion in revenue. Lansky wasn't joking. He was talking about scale, cash scale, no shares, no quarterly reports, no bell ringing on Wall Street. Their wealth wasn't paper valuation. It was liquid turnover. The kind that survived depressions because it fed on human appetite. Luciano once said they put 80% of profits back into corruption. Judges, police, sheriffs, senators, governors, entire precincts. Later, intelligence contacts, tax men. The lesson was simple. The best investment wasn't land or stock. It was a greedy official who would always need more. Lansky built the laundering architecture to make that scalable. Panama, Switzerland, the Caribbean. The same corridors used by corporate exporters and fruit companies. The same islands where political fixers operated. Money moved through them quietly, invisibly, until it blended with legitimate capital. And nowhere did that blending work better than Las Vegas. Vegas was an open territory. Any family could buy in, as long as they respected hidden ratios. Ownership was layered. There were the men listed on paper. And then there were the real owners. The skim was the oxygen. Cash-heavy businesses where money could be removed before it ever hit the books. Vending routes, jukebox circuits, ticket agencies, cigarette machines. But casinos were the bonanza. From 1960 to 1965, federal investigators concluded that 6 major casinos, the Fremont, Sands, Flamingo, Horseshoe, Desert Inn and Stardust were losing roughly $12 million a year off the top. That money never reached the IRS. It moved in bags. From counting rooms in Vegas to Miami. From Miami into offshore banks. From there into Swiss-numbered accounts. Lansky sat over the arithmetic, counting, dividing, distributing, keeping peace between official owners who wanted dividends and secret owners who wanted theft. Hidden shares in a casino could cost around $52,500 and yield $2,000 a month. Returns that dwarfed anything legitimate Wall Street offered. New Jersey crews collected tens of thousands monthly. Chicago took its cut. Cleveland took its cut. Lansky always took his. And the Gambino family had been in Vegas since the days of the Mangano brothers. Investments, interests, silent stakes. Brooklyn money ran west long before the neon lights became corporate. Then the exposure began. Life magazine printed the skim. Senate hearings circled. Investigators mapped the money flow. And just as the system was peaking, a new force entered the desert. Howard Hughes. Hughes wasn't a gangster. He was something more dangerous, a legitimate billionaire with federal contracts, defense ties, and unlimited capital. In the mid-1960s, he began quietly purchasing Vegas properties. The Desert Inn first, then others. He bought controlling interests. He pushed out mob-friendly managers. He brought corporate governance into a town that had been governed by envelopes. That changed everything. Once Hughes entered, Vegas stopped being a frontier and started becoming a regulated industry. Corporate boards replaced front men. Public companies acquired casinos. Banking transparency increased. The skim didn't disappear overnight, but the margins tightened and the risk skyrocketed. For Lansky, it meant recalibration. The counting rooms were no longer safe havens. The Bahamian channels grew more important. London, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the Middle East became fallback territories. Money that once moved comfortably through Vegas now had to travel farther and hide deeper. For Gambino, it meant something else. The desert was no longer dependable oxygen. Brooklyn still controlled the docks. The piers still answered to Gambino influence. Manhattan and New Jersey docks leaned Genovese. The International Longshoremen's Association was woven into the structure. But Vegas had been a clean artery of tax-free cash. When that artery narrowed, diversification became survival. That's when Wall Street fever caught their eye. Stolen securities became a new racket. Bonds and stock certificates lifted in brazen robberies, moved through couriers into Belgium and other European channels, then recycled back into American banks as collateral. Loans were taken, loans were repaid, the securities were reclaimed and used again. Money doubling in weeks, if the banker was frightened enough to cooperate. Federal investigators later identified bankers who facilitated it, some by greed, others by blackmail. And behind it all, the same principle held once. Organized crime entered a lawful enterprise. The enterprise didn't cleanse the criminals. The criminals contaminated the enterprise. The old street shakedown grew obsolete. Owning 95% of a municipal garbage route by squeezing out competition was quieter. Buying the right official was cleaner than threatening 10 small operators. Violence became selective. Influence became management. Hughes's corporate Vegas signaled the end of one era and the beginning of another. The skim could no longer run as loosely as it had. Legitimate capital had muscle now. Federal heat had sharpened. Public companies required books that could survive audit. Lansky adapted outward, offshore, deeper, structure, tighter. Gambino adapted inward. More emphasis on unions, ports, construction, securities. More white-collar insulation, less spectacle. Some bosses were turning into respectable magnates on paper. Others were aging into exile. But the machine they built, cash-based, corruption-funded, globally laundered, didn't collapse when Hughes landed in the desert. It evolved. Because you can shut down a counting room, you can indict a front man. But once the money is inside the system, inside banks, unions, securities markets, political offices, you're not fighting a gang anymore. You're fighting an ecosystem. Gigante came out of the 1959 Narcotics case the way the old rules demanded: quiet, sealed, and still standing. In Washington, on March 1, 1965, the Supreme Court refused to reopen Vito Genovese's conviction. The brief order left the 1959 verdicts intact. Genovese, 67 years old, remained in Leavenworth, hospitalized with high blood pressure and a heart condition, still feared, still giving instructions from a cell. With good time, he could be out on March 1, 1970. 5 more years was a long time to take orders from a prison bed, and everyone around him knew it. The appeal itself read like a roll call: Vincent Gigante, Natale Evola, Nicholas Lesser, Salvatore Santora, Ralph Polizzano, Charles Barcelona, Rocco Mazzi, Charles Di Palermo, Joseph Di Palermo. Men tied to the same case, the same pipeline, the same code. Most of them had reasons to be angry. Gigante had every reason to be furious. He didn't act like it. He didn't come out looking for an all-out war. He didn't come out trying to burn down old enemies or put a signature on the street. He came out with a scar the system leaves on men who understand the odds. The last thing he wanted was another bid. If he ever had to put on an act, if he ever had to look unfit, unstable, harmless, he would do it. It wasn't weakness. It was self-preservation. He went back to work. That was the advantage he carried into the late 1960s. He had done his time and he hadn't broken. He'd followed Omerta and stayed in the shadows. And in a world full of aging administrators, shadows were where the future lived. By 1968, the upper tier of the Genovese structure looked like a room full of old men doing math. Anthony Funzi Thierry was pushing 60. Russell Bufalino was in his mid-60s. Tommy Ryan, Eboli, was in his late 50s. Gerardo Jerry Cattina was 66. Philip Lombardo was around 60. Michael Miranda was in his early 70s. Vincent Allo was in his mid-60s. Gigante, born in 1928, was around 40. Young enough to carry weight, old enough to be trusted with it. That age gap mattered. It made him useful. It made him safe. It made him a candidate. Then the public noise returned. A few years earlier, Joseph Valschi had cracked the seal in front of senators and cameras. By 1968, the spillover was everywhere. Books, condensed versions, headlines, and names that men had spent their lives keeping out of print were being served to middle-class readers like current events. One of the complications for Gigante that year was the way old business got dragged back into daylight. Valschi's talk put him in the frame again, pointing at him as the shooter in the Frank Costello attempt. Costello followed Omerta. Gigante followed Omerta. But print brought heat, and heat brought questions, and questions brought microphones. Gigante didn't answer questions. He built insulation. He leaned into alliances that paid and didn't talk. Tommy Eboli's orbit. Funzi Thierry's orbit. The men who cared about stability more than pride. Fat Tony Salerno, Cattina, Miranda, Lombardo, Bufalino. These weren't romantics. They wanted their unions, their loans, their contracts, their quiet cash. They wanted the legitimate and illegitimate machinery running without interruption. That's where the family's internal frictions sat. Eboli looked like the kind of contender who could make a move in a new decade. Ambitious, willing to press rivals, willing to lean into confrontation while the climate was already dangerous. Gigante saw what that produced. Attention, grand juries, task forces, and men wiring garages. It didn't matter how brave you were if the whole city was listening. The way the rackets were changing only made that clearer. After New York City's cigarette tax jump in 1965, the money migrated south. North Carolina, one of the few holdouts without a cigarette tax, became a warehouse. What started as amateurs lining up in daylight turned into professionals operating at night. A phantom blue camper truck would load thousands of cartons in Rocky Mount or Weldon and roll north. Police would stake out the Holland Tunnel, the George Washington Bridge, every entrance that mattered, and the truck would never arrive. Because it wasn't meant to arrive. The load would hit a pre-arranged transfer point, often around Emporia, Virginia. The cigarettes would be shifted into other vehicles with different plates and different faces, designed to slide past the watchers. Out-of-state surveillance tightened. Local informers multiplied. The amateurs got scared off. The professionals went underground. The authorities said the racket was now dominated by organized crime money and method. The details said the same thing. Big loads required cash payments, $20,000, $30,000 at a time. And that kind of money wasn't being entrusted to a driver. Higher-ups were flying into airports like Raleigh-Durham to deliver cash in person. Counterfeit bills started showing up in payments. Hijackings of cigarette loads increased. Drivers carried pistols. One man carried a submachine gun. The violence hadn't fully erupted yet, but the warning was always the same. Once a pipeline like that is controlled, you don't get it back. A Brooklyn grand jury began bored into it, witness by witness. And the first identified mob figure hauled into that chamber was Vincent the Chin Gigante, named in the context of the Genovese organization, tied to the broader smuggling picture that was getting more sophisticated by the month. Even the suburban edges had the same odor. In Old Tappan, Bergen County, New Jersey, the police chief was suspended on departmental charges after allegations that he passed along money received from Olympia Gigante, envelopes meant for members of his department. Small town, simple allegation, big implication. Influence doesn't always arrive as a threat. Sometimes it arrives as a favor with a name on it. So, by 1968, the picture wasn't a single dramatic eruption. It was a quiet consolidation. Genovese was still officially the boss, but the courts had shut the door on him and the calendar was running. His colleagues had already been reported as waiting on that appeal before moving toward choosing a new chief. The structure above Gigante was aging. The environment around them was tightening, and the money was moving into systems that rewarded discipline. Unions, construction, interstate freight, smuggling routes, banking angles, cash deliveries handled by trusted men, meetings that never needed minutes. In that climate, the smartest move wasn't war. It was patience. Gigante's advantage was that he didn't need to declare himself. He could let older men keep their titles and carry their heat while he carried the work. He could be seen as steady, useful, and quiet. Everything a tired organization wanted when it was being watched. And when the old administration finally cracked under time, illness, and succession, the man best positioned to inherit power wasn't the one who shouted for it. It was the one who already had his hands on the levers, moving things without making them move. January 1968 opened like a warning shot. Not in the streets, in hearing rooms. At 14 Vesey Street in Lower Manhattan, a joint legislative crime committee chaired by State Senator John Hughes began weekly public hearings designed to do one thing: put organized crime's footprint in legitimate business on the record. Piers, restaurants, labor consulting, nightclubs, Wall Street. The committee's chief counsel, Edward J. McLaughlin, made it clear they weren't just collecting testimony. They were building an argument for stronger tools: eavesdropping, wiretapping, the kind of surveillance lawmakers had been hesitant to authorize. Investigators had already compiled what they called an impressive picture of how far the mob had pushed into normal commerce. The hard part wasn't the evidence. It was getting people to talk. Subpoenas had to be served early, aggressively, one man in bed, others at the breakfast table. Because too many witnesses were ducking service. Carlo Gambino didn't need to sit in that room to feel the heat. Those hearings were aimed right at his terrain. The waterfront, the unions, the back rooms where consulting meant control. And then McLaughlin said the quiet part out loud. Wall Street was a prime new target. Not rumor, tape recordings. A loan shark pressuring a debtor into unloading stolen securities on the open market. That wasn't a street racket anymore. That was a financial pipeline. The same week, the smaller stories told the same truth. The family wasn't living off corner envelopes. It was living inside systems. In Brooklyn, federal authorities arrested Salvatore Guglielmini, 35, a supermarket butcher accused of running up more than $15,000 in fraudulent credit card charges across 200 establishments from New York to Florida. On paper, it looked like a petty hustle. Credit cards, forged signatures, a missing partner. But the federal officials didn't describe him as just another crook. They described his family as important. His relatives were identified as soldiers in the Agnello della Croce faction, Della Croce having been long associated with the Gambino structure, and the write-up did what these write-ups always do. It connected bloodlines. Related to Gambino. Related to Paul Castellano. A small fraud case was really a glimpse of how far the family's social wiring ran. Butcher shops, banks, addresses in Brooklyn, names that kept recurring. And while state committees were trying to pry open the present, the press was dragging the past into daylight. In late January, columnist Jack Anderson published a piece built around a new government informer, an old Mafia hand described as Jim Carra, codenamed Operation Don. The article wasn't about 1968 rackets on its face. It was about lineage, how the Mafia operated, how it killed, how it used narcotics routes, how it handled internal discipline. But then it landed on a detail that mattered in Gambino's world. Carra identified one of Albert Anastasia's alleged barbershop shooters as Joe Coniglio, also known as Joe Biondo, and noted that after Anastasia died, he got his job back from the new boss, Carlo Gambino. That's what those stories did. They didn't just describe crimes. They stitched biographies into public record. They made alleged feel like known. They made a boss's name part of the common vocabulary. By February, the drumbeat became national enforcement strategy. Victor Riesel wrote about a Justice Department strike force aimed at Brooklyn, meaning the Eastern District of New York stretching out to Long Island, a region he described as the summer and winter capital of American crime. The point wasn't romance, it was concentration. He said this was where the syndicate's executives lived now, and he framed it like a corporate headquarters, hundreds of millions in securities, Manhattan real estate, businesses of all kinds. Then he singled out the smallest, toughest combine in that world, Carlo Gambino's group. Riesel described Gambino as a man who never testified, protected by a standing doctor's certificate, while simultaneously operating like an aggressive investor. Real estate, paper production, meat packing, stock market plunges. He quoted federal prosecutors and highlighted a message that would have sounded like a threat to anyone who understood the real estate and securities turn. Don't let them open the door. Once they're inside a bank, a brokerage house, an insurance company, they don't leave. They become part of the structure. That's how the start of 1968 looked from Gambino's seat. Not a single case, but a convergence. Because while committees were mapping infiltration and federal writers were advertising strike forces, Street-level rackets were still feeding the machine, and the arrests kept tracing back to Gambino names. In March, a fur hijacking investigation pulled in Frank Joseph Moccardi of Yonkers, described as a major figure, identified by Joseph Valachi as a key member of the Gambino family. The story wasn't just about mink coats. It was about a fence network, stolen goods moving into legitimate channels. Federal agents and local police recovered hundreds of thousands of dollars in furs from Freeport on Long Island and New Rochelle, plus another recovery at a fur sales corporation on West 29th Street in Manhattan. 6 men were arrested as receivers. The ring was said to have stolen over $1 million in pelts and finished pieces through 3 truck hijackings in 1967. That's the kind of case that seems local until you realize what it represents. Control over distribution, laundering through storefront commerce, and a cash stream that can be reinvested anywhere. Then the spotlight widened across the river into New Jersey. In Trenton, the Criminal Justice Study Committee heard blunt testimony. The alleged leaders of 7 mafia families operating in New Jersey were named publicly by the state attorney general. Carlo Gambino's name was placed on the same line as Vito Genovese, Joseph Colombo, Joseph Bonanno, Angelo Bruno, Samuel de Cavalcante, and Thomas Lucchese. The consultant to the committee, Elliot Lombard, said the part out loud that always embarrassed institutions. State and local police had never made a case against a major mafia figure, not because the activity wasn't there, but because the system wasn't convicting or deterring. The state police had known for years. They just weren't landing the big fish. A few days later, the United States Attorney for New Jersey went further, naming individual power brokers operating in the state, identifying Anthony Little Pussy Russo of Deal as a shore boss, alongside men like Gerardo Catena and Sam de Cavalcante. The hearings weren't simply informational. They were a signal. New Jersey was no longer a quiet staging area. It was being described publicly as a contested field, with overlapping family influence, gambling, loan sharking, and business infiltration. And business infiltration was exactly where the Gambino family's name kept surfacing in the spring. In April, the Manhattan District Attorney announced perjury indictments connected to a grand jury probe into underworld influence in corporate labor disputes and maintenance contracts. The company at the center was Spartans Industries, owner of the E.J. Corvette chain, big retail, multiple outlets, and major shopping centers. A prominent executive, David Thorne, vice president in charge of maintenance and construction, was indicted for allegedly lying about whether he asked Joseph Zingaro to intercede in a labor dispute at a Corvette store in Westbury on Long Island, and whether Zingaro served as a middleman in steering maintenance contracts. Zingaro was described as a member of the Gambino family. Alongside him were John Gregory Buster Ardito, described as a Genovese figure, and a gambler named Samuel Schlitten. The contracts weren't glamorous: cleaning, snow removal, window washing, rubbish removal, floor waxing. That's how the mob modernized. You don't need a headline racket. You need recurring invoices. You need companies that pay monthly. You need a reason to meet executives without anyone asking why. Then the investigation exposed the other half of the mechanism. Disposal. A waterfront construction inspector named Daniel Colucci was indicted for perjury and contempt. He was accused of taking, or agreeing to take, $5,000 to delay filing a report about landfill quality at Leland Avenue and O'Brien Avenue in the Bronx. The fill was supposed to be rock, stone, brick. Instead, the site was packed with garbage, junk, lumber, even a wrecked car. The alleged payoff was linked to the same pair, Joseph Zingaro and John Buster Ardito. The angle was brutally practical: collect garbage from a retail chain, dump it as landfill, save dumping fees, get paid twice, once for pickup, once by avoiding disposal costs. The story even listed the corporate shell used at the site, a construction company with an officer tied by family connection to another organized crime figure. To Gambino, that wasn't just a scandal. It was a blueprint of vulnerability. Because the new mob wasn't hiding in alleys. It was negotiating with executives, leaning on inspectors, shaping contracts, burying garbage under construction projects, and using legitimate business relationships as camouflage. That's exactly why hearings like the ones at Vesey Street mattered. They weren't chasing bookmakers. They were chasing infiltration. The word law enforcement used when crime stopped looking like crime. And it all fed the same pressure point. Public exposure plus investigative tools. Wiretaps, eavesdropping, strike forces, grand juries willing to indict executives for perjury. Newspapers print names, addresses, job titles, and the connective tissue between family members and capo regimes. A state attorney general in New Jersey, reading out a list of families like it, was an organizational chart. The syndicate's strength had always been that it didn't need publicity. It needed quiet cooperation. In 1968, quiet was being stripped away. For Carlo Gambino, the impact was direct and indirect at the same time. Direct because his name was appearing in hearings, columns, and law enforcement testimony as a symbol of infiltration in labor, waterfront operations, securities, corporate contracts, and receiving networks. Indirect because the larger environment was changing around him. Law enforcement was shifting away from chasing isolated crimes and toward proving systems, enterprise, conspiracy, infiltration. The same world that made skims and sweetheart contracts possible was now being mapped in public. And once the public map exists, the pressure doesn't stop at the street guys. It crawls up toward the men who never testify, especially the ones who survive by never being on the record. Committees learned where to look. Prosecutors learned how to frame it. Reporters learned how to print it, so the names stuck. And when the machinery is being described in full sentences, piers, Wall Street, retail contracts, garbage routes, stolen goods, interstate influence, there's only one move left for a boss who intends to live. Shrink the noise, increase insulation, push more money into cleaner fronts. Let others take the arrests. Because when the world starts calling your business infiltration, the next word is always enterprise. And once they start building enterprise cases, they don't need a gunman in the street. They need a pattern. April and May of 1968 didn't read like crime news. It read like inventory. Names, addresses, ranks, the machinery laid out in daylight, how money moved, how contracts were fixed, how silence was enforced, and how Carlo Gambino's world stayed profitable even while it was being dragged into hearing rooms and grand juries. It started with something the public didn't expect, the mob getting hunted by its own. A Nassau County gambler named Samuel "Sammy" Shell Schlitten, Atlantic Beach, was already on the radar for being one of 3 underworld figures tied to an attempt to infiltrate the EJ Corvette store at Carly Place. The allegation was simple. An executive denied asking for help in a labor dispute. Prosecutors said the help was asked for anyway. And the names around Schlitten mattered: Joseph Joey Z. Zingaro, connected to the Gambino structure, and John Buster Ardito, tied to the Genovese family. Labor disputes, maintenance contracts, refuse removal. The kind of business that is dull until you realize it pays every month. Then Newsday added a twist that told you how unstable the ecosystem had become. A maverick kidnapping gang was snatching mob earners and holding them for ransom. Schlitten's brother-in-law, Angelo Marino, was taken. The kidnappers asked for more than $50,000 and settled for $5,000 when Schlitten refused to go higher. Schlitten was hauled before a grand jury, refused to answer, invoked self-incrimination, got threatened with contempt by Supreme Court Justice Mitchell Schwitzer, took 10 minutes to think it over, then went back in and testified. What he said stayed sealed, but the point was out in the open. Even the law of silence was cracking under pressure from a different kind of fear. This wasn't an abstract threat. Another man already surfaced as a victim of the same kidnapping crew, Michael Luongo, a top policy figure. And then the story hit a Gambino nerve directly. Rocco Mazzi, identified as a capo regime in the Gambino family, was arrested for refusing to testify about the kidnapping of his nephew. The report said the gang had taken more than 10 mob figures and collected more than $200,000. It had killed at least one victim when the ransom didn't come. That detail matters because it changes the risk calculus. A family like Gambino's lives on discipline and predictability. A rogue crew kidnapping earners is a threat to stability. It forces internal responses, more insulation, tighter vetting, less freelancing, more pressure to keep underlings in line before outsiders start treating them like walking bank accounts. Then the business cases kept unfolding. Newsday reported that federal and city authorities were taking a hard look at the murder of a Brooklyn trucker, executed in a way that screamed contract work. Bound, gagged, shot 3 times in the head. The report said he owed the Gambino family nearly $500,000 and had been paying down the debt by letting his trucks be used in hijacking operations. One of his associates was described as a Gambino soldier, arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for directing a fur hijacking ring. The implication was blunt. The trucker was starting to talk, and the talking got shut down. That is how power protects itself in a system built on credit and fear. The debt makes you usable. The debt also makes you disposable. By early May, the streets and the boardrooms were colliding in public. A federal grand jury in Brooklyn indicted 49 men tied to a hijacking ring and rounded up 24 of them in coordinated arrests across Brooklyn and New Jersey. The ring was blamed for at least 9 robberies between May and December 1967, stretching from Kearny, New Jersey, to Westbury, Long Island. Goods stolen weren't glamorous. Butter, corn oil, pork products, clothing, Christmas ornaments. That's the point. It's commerce. It's inventory. It's the kind of theft that can be fenced quietly if you have the right channels. A source close to the investigation said members of the Gambino and Colombo families were key figures. 2 names were put into print with Brooklyn addresses, Daniel Turner and Joseph Butch Musumeci. Turner was described as an associate of Carmine the Doctor Lombardozzi, identified as a Gambino soldier, and also linked to an international credit card operation. Musumeci was described as a Colombo soldier and a bodyguard for Al the Blast Gallo. Prosecutors called him the Strong Arm. Another enforcer, Richard De Matteo, was described as more violent. The ring, the government said, wasn't just stealing. It was moving stolen goods to fences who turned them back into cash. At the same time, the credit card cases widened into something larger and uglier. A portable identity racket that could move people, money, and influence across the country without carrying a suitcase of cash. Investigators described an international credit card ring built around diners' club cards. More than 1,000 cards stolen from a Maspeth firm that embossed and mailed cards to customers. They said the ring had run up more than $600,000 in bills and had already been tied to a metropolitan hijacking gang and a nationwide Cadillac theft ring. The ring had reach, and the reach wasn't just about fraud. Sources close to the investigation said a key ring figure, already jailed on other charges, was the chief suspect in the contract murder of John Futses, a major Genovese figure found dead in his Cadillac in Miami Beach in March 1967. The suspect allegedly bragged he was paid $70,000. Another allegation was even more telling. Seymour Rudelfsky, a former credit manager, was said to have been paid $10,000 by 3 top Cosa Nostra leaders to find a safe route to Hawaii for mobsters using credit cards. This was modern organized crime in plain language. Build a safe travel and spending lane that doesn't trigger alarms, then use it to expand operations. And the ring wasn't only servicing mob travel. It was allegedly used to move prostitutes coast to coast for the entertainment of wealthy business and entertainment figures. It was also used to send mob figures to Las Vegas to collect skimming profits from gambling casinos. The old pipeline, cash out of casinos, was still feeding men back east. Even in a story about plastic cards, Las Vegas was still in the background, still a collection point. The Gambino connection surfaced repeatedly through Lombardozzi. One day it was a meeting at Andy's Lounge on 18th Avenue in Brooklyn, where investigators arrested Joseph Virgo on mail fraud conspiracy charges and said Lombardozzi and Anthony Lucania would be subpoenaed because of the contact. Another day, it was the indictment trail pointing to Turner as an associate of Lombardozzi. The same name keeps appearing because the network isn't random. It's layered. Then the Labour Front lit up again, this time tied to the biggest construction money in the region. Newsday reported that fear and the law of silence were hampering a state investigation commission inquiry into racketeering connected to the 1964 to 1965 World's Fair and the billion-dollar construction industry. The investigation was described as aimed at Carlo Gambino of Massapequa and officials tied to union locals, bricklayers and tenders Local 47 and mason tenders Local 13 of Long Island City. Subpoenas were issued for Gambino, lieutenants, and union officers. Miles Lane, the chairman, confirmed the inquiry. A spokesman said witnesses wouldn't talk. Dozens, by the report, were too afraid to tell what they knew. The details described were the old methods refined into paper crime: alleged shakedowns of construction firms, kickbacks to union officials, phony billing, excessive overtime assigned to union employees who had to kick back overtime, pay, just to keep working. The story also noted alleged ties spanning both Genovese and Gambino circles, exactly the sort of overlap a construction racket requires because jobs don't respect family boundaries when the money's large enough. It also added the kind of violence that keeps witnesses afraid. Basil Tervone's union had been under investigation since 1959. Charges had ended in a hung jury in 1966. Cervone's brother George had been murdered in July 1966, and a key witness, Vincent the Cat Siciliano, had survived multiple attempts on his life since 1959. That's not background color. That's enforcement. It explains why people shut their mouths when subpoenas arrive. The pressure wasn't only investigative, it was financial. On May 10th, a Gambino soldier named Big Frank Pasqua Mastic was charged with failing to pay income taxes on $23,429 earned in 1962. Prosecutors said the money came from a stock transaction, part of a deal over $50,000. They described Pasqua as a former narcotics figure, once listed as the biggest heroin distributor in the Chicago area, though his earlier conviction had been overturned. The bail argument included a detail prosecutors like to use when they wanted judges to see flight risk and hidden life. He maintained a second residence in the Bronx. That's another theme running through 1968. Organized crime wasn't only stealing, it was investing, stocks, real estate, contracts, businesses that let illegal money appear normal. Put all of it together and the shape is clear. The Gambino family's influence in 1968 isn't shown through one big indictment that topples a boss. It shows through the steady appearance of the same names across different systems: construction locals, refuse routes, retail maintenance contracts, hijacking rings, credit card fraud, tax cases, and intimidation. Even the chaos, kidnappings of mob earners by a disgruntled underling crew, points to the same reality. The empire had grown so large that men inside it started trying to tax it from below. A parallel racket, feeding off the main racket. That kind of instability forces a boss into adaptation. Tighten the circle, Reduce exposure. Keep the earners earning and the talkers quiet. Push more money into fronts that can survive scrutiny. Let soldiers and capo regimes take the headlines, while the leadership stays behind medical certificates, closed doors, and layers of legitimate-looking paper. Because once the newspapers are printing not just the crimes, but the addresses. Once commissions are issuing subpoenas, once grand juries are threatening contempt, once prosecutors are mapping how garbage routes become landfill scams and how maintenance contracts become kickback streams. The danger isn't only prison. The danger is that the public starts to understand the system. And when the public understands the system, law enforcement stops chasing individuals and starts building enterprise cases. That's what was happening to Gambino's world, turning separate rackets into one pattern, visible enough to name, detailed enough to prosecute, and broad enough to threaten the business model that kept the whole structure alive. By late May 1968, the story wasn't a single case. It was a stack of cases, each one showing a different door into the same house: labor, construction, welfare funds, Wall Street paper, cut-rate retail, guns, loan sharking. And every time the door opened, the same names, the same roles, the same methods showed up again. In Washington, a labor columnist was already pushing the good news line straight from the top. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director J. Edgar Hoover saying the manicured mafia leaders were no longer untouchable, that the National Commission was under caretaker control, that Chicago had to drag elder statesmen out of retirement, Paul the waiter, Rica, and Tony Accardo, to run a regency, and that in New York, the quietly aggressive United States Attorney Robert Morgenthau had smashed 3 syndicate commands. The columnist wrote Carlo Gambino had been forced into semi-retirement by Federal Bureau of Investigation pressure. Then the column got into what mattered: manpower and money. The Justice Department's organized crime and racketeering section begging Congress for 24 additional lawyers, about $330,000 a year, 20 assigned to new task forces, only 2 for the Special Labor Unit. The same labor unit, operating since early 1967 with 8 lawyers, already sitting on a mountain of violations, 1,113 reports under the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act and the Welfare and Pension Plans Disclosure Act, 351 Hobbs Act extortion violations, 385 Taft-Hartley violations. The column laid it out like a ledger: organized crime syndicates terrorizing thousands of union officials, hundreds of businesses, mishandling hundreds of millions in welfare and pension funds, about $14 billion dispersed annually. And it told readers what to watch for next: indictments, exposure of shakedown syndicates, and especially the infiltration of construction locals, the service trades, the labor supply choke points, construction, waterfront, trucking, where control of a local meant control of the job. That was the Washington version. The Bureau digging hard, the Justice Department begging for staff, Congress dragging its feet, and the public being told the Dons were semi-retired because pressure was finally working. Back in New York, the pressure had a different sound. It wasn't upbeat, it was recorded. On June 12th, at State Investigation Commission hearings, the details landed in open session. Members of the Carlo Gambino and Vito Genovese crime families, accused of dictating union appointments and using corruption and violence to fill the coffers. The target locals weren't abstract: Mason Tender's union locals 13 and 47. The Commission's witnesses described a structure inside the Gambino side called the administration, a top layer of lieutenants that dictated appointments and controlled rackets through the union. And the way it was uncovered mattered. An electronic listening device installed in a garage operated by Gambino soldier Michael Scandifia, formerly of Oakdale. The bug captured a conversation among Scandifia, Gambino Lieutenant Peter P.T. Pumps Ferrara, and soldier recursion Gus Marinelli, a local 47 shop steward. The subject was an appointment, Union delegate Thomas Tommy Brown Cucchiara. Marinelli asked if it came from the administration. Ferrara told him yes, they were ordering it. The hearing testimony identified the membership list the bug revealed: Carlo Gambino, Joseph Riccobone, Carmine Lombardozzi, Joseph Zingaro, and underboss Joseph Joe Banti Biondo. The words weren't influence, it was dictated. The testimony also described how a Gambino soldier inside Local 47 gave orders to the local's business agent while setting up loan sharking, gambling, and kickback rackets at construction sites. One man inside the local owning the business agent, which is how these locals worked when they were captured. Local 13 had its own arrangement. Basil Bobby Cervone, installed as business agent after an agreement between Genovese and Gambino factions, and then said to be taking orders from Michel Mike Miranda, described as an advisor to the Genovese family. The hearing included the allegation that Cervone paid $5,000 to have union member Vincent Siciliano murdered. Cervone questioned, pleaded the Fifth Amendment dozens of times about that allegation, about the murder of his brother George Cavone, about the whole structure. A week later, June 20th, the commission kept squeezing, and the pattern widened from appointments and kickbacks to the welfare funds, the quiet bank that never sleeps. Two doctors, Dr. Henry J. Myers and Dr. Rosario Arnone of Queens, repeatedly invoked the Fifth Amendment when asked if they signed thousands of dollars worth of fraudulent medical and disability claims for a mob-backed union business agent. The late business agent's name was George Blackie D'Agostino of Mason Tenders, Local 46, described as backed by the Gambino side. Witnesses said they never saw Myers, never were treated by him. One man said he was in Europe and not even a union member when a claim for $1,422 was approved with Myers' signature attached, listing coronary artery disease. The questions were blunt. Did you know D'Agostino? Are these your signatures? Did you treat these claimants? The answers were Fifth Amendment. Arnone invoked the Fifth too, but when asked if he knew Michel Miranda, he smiled and said he did not know him. Yet he saw him every Sunday in church because they lived in the same Forest Hills neighborhood. D'Agostino had lived in that section too. The hearing record even spelled out the consequence. Any evidence of malpractice or fraud could be referred to the State Board of Regents through the Education Department's professional conduct process. But Supreme Court rulings meant doctors couldn't be automatically suspended merely for taking the Fifth. They dragged a former Union Secretary-Treasurer into it as well, Carmelo Romano of Queens, who refused to identify his alleged signature on more than 20 medical claims and refused to discuss whether he had a record. The commission produced an arrest history anyway: assault to robbery, a bookmaking conviction. The current Local 46 business manager, Sidney Gambino of North Massapequa, no relation to Carlo Gambino, said he worked with D'Agostino but claimed he knew nothing about the alleged fraud, and he couldn't explain how men between 62 and 83 years old were carried on the books as active members. On June 21st, when the hearings closed, the Commission Chairman Miles Lane called it what it looked like in plain terms: a sordid picture of what happens when criminal elements take control of a union. Testimony indicated at least $60,000 paid out on fraudulent disability claims over 3 years, and contractors arranging with union officials not to pay at least $120,000 into welfare and pension funds. The president of the Mason Tenders Union in the New York area, Charles Graziano, told the commission he knew nothing about plundering until the probe started, then admitted that when Cervone was ousted in 1966, the International had warned him in writing about racketeers and Shylocks circling the locals, and members wanting protection. The hearing record tied the first focus on the council to the murders around Local 13, including the killing of Cervone's brother George. It ran through the mechanics too: men signed up who never worked as Mason tenders, false claims filed, checks handed over for less than what was due, checks made out to cash. D'Agostino, as business agent, was supposed to ensure contractors paid 10% of wages into welfare and pension. Witnesses said the reality was negotiated, shaved, and pocketed. While that was happening in hearing rooms, the street-level business kept moving, and the same names kept surfacing in new contexts. On June 22nd, District Attorney Frank Hogan's office indicted Eli Zaret, a city official in the Receivership Bureau. On charges, he took $500 in cash payoffs from Anthony Strachey, John Buster Ardito, and Joseph Zingaro, in return for awarding them contracts totaling $14,000 for rubbish removal from abandoned city-owned tenements. It mattered because Zaret, as bureau director, could award contracts up to $2,500 without public bidding. The indictment dated the payments to March 30th to April 7th, 1967. And it tied right back into the earlier Corvette and landfill stories. Same trio, same alleged pattern. Access to contracts, refuse removal, payoffs, and city systems that could be bent cheaply if the right person signed the paper. Then, July came in with the kind of case that shows how money gets washed without looking like laundering. A $100,000 United States Treasury bill, one of a stolen batch totaling $750,000 taken from Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner, and Smith, turns up in Zurich, Switzerland. The Daily News reported 2 reputed Cosa Nostra figures were indicted for transporting it from New York to Zurich to open a Swiss bank account using the bill as a deposit. Charles Paul Dongara of Milltown, New Jersey, described as connected to the Carlo Gambino family, and Angelo Joseph Greta of Brooklyn, described as connected to the Joseph Colombo side. The story read like a cautionary tale. They asked an investment banker to help them open the Swiss account. They travelled with him. In Zurich, the banker asked Union Bank of Switzerland to check with Chase Manhattan Bank in New York for a stop payment action. The answer came back that the bill was stolen. The 2 men were arrested on June 20th. Swiss authorities cooperated in returning them. The same report noted how widely the stolen bills had scattered. One $100,000 bill turning up in Liechtenstein near Switzerland, others in gambling houses in Las Vegas, others in Boston, with recoveries but no arrests in those other cities at the time. And while the paper money was moving overseas, a different kind of legit operation was being described as mob-financed on the ground. On July 11th, Brooklyn District Attorney Aaron Cooter's office arrested 14 people in a scheme allegedly backed by Cosa Nostra money to swindle dealers out of millions of dollars worth of merchandise. 50 detectives hit Brooklyn and Queens at 5 in the morning with 23 search warrants. They moved $500,000 worth of seized goods with rented trailers and the district attorney's own vehicles. The merchandise wasn't exotic. Razor blades, televisions, phonographs, radios, clothing, sold through cut-rate outlets that underpriced honest dealers. Cooter said businessmen had complained they were competing with mob money. He described the mechanics the way it actually works. A firm opens with a clean-looking bank deposit, $30,000, earns a credit rating from Dun & Bradstreet, buys with cash, then cash and checks, then checks only, then goes dark, closes bank accounts, disappears, right before a holiday weekend. After the 4th of July, checks start bouncing. The firm listed phony officers. A similar operation was found at another Brooklyn address. Cooter said those arrested were linked to the Thomas, Three-Finger Brown Lucchese and Carlo Gambino crime families. And he said the probe would keep going, focusing on labor racketeer Johnny Dio Guardi, and a man named Paul Barrio, described as a loan shark and policy operator. And the victims list was pure mainstream America. Procter & Gamble, Playtex, Swank, Westinghouse Electric, Scott Paper, and others. 5 years of swindle work, Cooter said, before it got pulled into daylight. 2 days later, July 13th, another daylight scene. A harassing raid spoils a luncheon in a midtown Chinese restaurant. Carlo Gambino, Joseph Colombo, and Angelo Bruno are arrested along with 3 others. They're brought before a judge. The loitering charges are dismissed. 6 men walk out the door. The point of a raid like that was never the loitering charge. It was to put faces to names and to let everyone watching understand that the leadership could be interrupted in public, even if the paperwork didn't hold. By late July, Kuta was back in the headlines again, this time with guns. On July 26th, 4 men are arrested and 55 unregistered guns are seized in Brooklyn raids, including a waterfront drugstore where the district attorney said guns were sold over the counter as casually as aspirin. One suspect was described as a member of the Carlo Gambino crime family. 25 guns were seized at Longo's pharmacy. Another 30 handguns were seized in simultaneous raids, including automatic pistols. Kuta said the guns were stolen from the mail, imported from North Carolina, and bought from a Maryland gun firm by a man using a fictitious name and Brooklyn address. Police searched for another suspect tied to a group called the Deerslayers Gun Club. Then July ended, the way these months kept ending: fear on the ground, money in the middle, and a family name sitting behind it like a signature. In Suffolk, a loan shark ring is described as so feared that borrowers refused to talk during a 6-month investigation. Victims were forced to pay 500% interest, threatened with beatings, threatened with harm to families, sometimes forced to sell cars and household goods to keep up. Bars connected to victims were wrecked. Police described the ringleader as Sebastian Benny Biondo, a singer-musician who billed himself as the Al Jolson of Long Island, identified as the nephew of Joseph Little Rabbit Biondo, an underboss in the crime family once run by Carlo Gambino, and then headed by Agnello della Croce. The other arrests were Gaetano De Sesco, tied to a bookmaking ring in the Joseph Colombo family, and Andrew Prelli, described as the strong-arm collector. One businessman borrowed $1,000, paid more than $3,600 in interest, still owed $1,940, and went bankrupt trying to get free. That's how it read in 1968, when you stop treating each story as a separate headline and start reading them the way investigators read them. The Union Treasury, the Welfare Fund, the contract, the cut rate store, the stolen Treasury paper, the weapons pipeline, the vigorish, different storefronts, same ownership. By the late summer of 1968, the pressure wasn't abstract anymore. It had names, docket numbers, sealed indictments, hotel meeting rooms, and missing men. On August 23rd, the Federal Bureau of Investigation picked up 8 men on conspiracy charges tied to the interstate transportation of $70,000 in stolen checks taken from the Manhattan brokerage firm Orvis Brothers Company. The arrests reached into Staten Island and Brooklyn, but the name that mattered was Carmine Lombardozzi, identified in a 1965 Senate report as a leader within the Carlo Gambino family. The indictment laid it out cleanly. Lombardozzi allegedly directed that accounts be opened in Manhattan banks. The stolen checks, made out to Orvis Brothers, were deposited. Withdrawals followed. One $17,000 check payable to a Jersey City bank cleared through Queens and New Jersey, which gave federal agents their hook. Without that interstate clearance, the strike force attorney said, there would have been no federal case. The mechanics were simple. The discipline behind them was not. The indictment alleged meetings in Manhattan hotels to coordinate the operation. Among those named were Lombardozzi's brother Daniel and others already in custody. It was a reminder of something the hearings had shown all year. The Gambino structure didn't just muscle unions. It moved paper. It opened accounts. It used banks like tools. Then, almost as if to underline the theme, the press dropped another story into the bloodstream. In late August, a long piece circulated nationally about Frank Sinatra and what it called the Mafia's elite. It wasn't gossip. It was built from court records, Senate testimony, law enforcement files. It traced Sinatra's friendships from Willie Moretti in New Jersey to Lucky Luciano in Naples and Havana, to the Fischetti brothers from Chicago to Sam Giancana, to the fight with Nevada's gaming board over Giancana's presence at the Cal Neva Lodge. It described how casino regulators blacklisted top gangsters and how Sinatra surrendered his Nevada license rather than disavow an old friend. It named Raymond Patriarca and Gaetano Lucchese as secret interests at a Massachusetts racetrack. And, buried near the end, was a quiet line. Last October, Sinatra had driven to Connecticut to visit the home of Dave Iacovetti, identified as a member of the Carlo Gambino family. It wasn't an indictment. It was something worse. Legitimacy bleeding into celebrity, celebrity bleeding into politics, and the names of crime bosses being printed in mainstream columns as if they were industrialists. Out west, the war inside the Bonanno family was burning hot, and Tucson was no longer neutral ground. The Arizona Daily Star ran a special report that read like a ledger of explosions. The list stretched back to 1954, but 1967 and 1968 were different. The bombs came in clusters. July 6, 1967, an explosion in front of PAT Homes Incorporated on East 22nd Street. July 25th, Molotov cocktails thrown into 2 lumber distributors' lots. August 2nd, JP's Club on South Rosemont Avenue hit. September 17th, a firebomb at a residence on East Edison Street. November 4th, the roof of the closed Tropical Inn Lounge torn open. Then, 1968, February 18th, kitchen roof of the Tidelands Motor Inn blasted. July 21st, an auto shed destroyed at Grace Ranch east of Tucson, owned by Pete Licavoli, long linked to the Detroit Mafia. July 22nd, a bomb tears through the patio wall at 1847 East Elm Street, the Tucson home of Joseph Bonanno. August 16, a device in the backyard of a home on Spanish Well Road. September 13th, an explosion at Metric Auto Plastic on North Stone Avenue. September 16th, bombs at a North Iroquois Avenue home and behind a beauty salon on East Speedway. September 18th, devices in a backyard on Via Rotunda, and another dud bomb found on North Iroquois. No one was killed in those particular blasts. That didn't make them harmless. The city understood the message. The paper ran through the history without romanticism. The garroted body of Louis Sirota, found in a trunk in 1960. Louis Janssen shot in front of an apartment tied to Victor Coletti, whose father had once attended the Appalachian meeting. Freddie Chrysler's 1964 suicide after questioning in a vending machine war. The disappearance of Rudy Perfetto and Morris Brady the day Janssen was killed. And at the center of Tucson's shadow stood Joseph Bonanno, called Peppino, Johnny Bananas, Joe Bananas, indicted for perjury in Canada, branded a mafia chief by Joseph Valachi before the Senate, indicted in Phoenix, charged in New York, kidnapped off a Park Avenue sidewalk in 1964, resurfacing in 1966, restored briefly to his Brooklyn throne by his son Salvatore, before the rebellion led by Paul Siaka hardened into open war. By 1968, that war had spilled into New York streets as well. 6 killings, 7 bombing attempts, grand juries convened. Acting District Attorney Elliot Golden hauled in soldiers and lieutenants from both factions, Natalia Vola, Pasquale Gigante, Joseph Mastrocola, Angelo Lappi and others, warning that contempt citations would follow if silence held. Behind closed doors, the commission, the real one, moved. Joseph Colombo, Agnello della Croce, Carlo Gambino, Carmine Tramunti. They reportedly warned both sides to cool it. Too much blood meant too much heat from federal and state grand juries. The Siaka faction had backing. Bonanno and his son refused to bend. The war grew too loud. It was ordered quiet. While that internal war was being tamped down, another front was unraveling in New York. On October 16th, 6 Bonanno figures appeared before a Kings County grand jury probing the same feud. No immunity offered. All expected to return. The next day, a departmental trial that had dragged for years came to an end. Suspended patrolman Leonard Grossman's fate was handed to Police Commissioner Howard Leary. Grossman had been linked in taped conversations to Michael Scandifire, identified as a member of the Gambino family, accused of supplying guns and dum-dum bullets allegedly intended for the murder of federal informers. The original criminal indictment had been dismissed on Fourth Amendment grounds over electronic eavesdropping. The departmental case was different. Grossman faced dismissal and the loss of roughly $50,000 in back pay. In November, he was fired. Then men started disappearing. On December 11th, police in Hillsdale, New Jersey, reported that Michael Scandifire, 50 years old, an ex-convict, appealing a 6-year federal sentence for transporting $410,000 in counterfeit Shell Oil Union bonds, had not been seen since leaving his home to pick up prescription medicine. He was also awaiting trial on other indictments: extortion, conspiracy, income tax evasion. Days later, Grossman's lawyer revealed that Grossman himself was missing. His wife and children were gone from their Brooklyn address. The phone disconnected. The lawyer received a chilling message. "You're not going to see him again. He's not around anymore." Grossman had been offered immunity months earlier to testify about a 1963 murder. Now both he and Scandifire had vanished from the map. If 1968 had stopped there, it would have been enough. But the year had one more blow, and it wasn't delivered by a bomb or a grand jury. It came in print. The Valachi Papers, Peter Maas's book built from conversations with Joseph Valachi, finally broke free after a 3-year fight. The Justice Department had attempted to block publication in 1966 at the urging of Italian-American leaders, arguing reputational harm. Nicholas Katzenbach had sought an injunction. Robert Kennedy, according to Maas, predicted the White House might quietly prefer the book killed. The court battle dragged on. By late 1967 and into 1968, the book was out. Reader's Digest carried a 12,000-word condensation. Valachi's testimony had already introduced Cosa Nostra to the public in 1963. The book did more. It named what it called the Commission, the Board of Directors, Vito Genovese, still feared in Leavenworth, Carlo Gambino and Joseph Colombo in New York, Joseph Bonanno of Brooklyn and Arizona, John Scalish in Cleveland, Joseph Zerilli in Detroit, Sam Giancana in Chicago, Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo, Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia. And it said plainly that Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, though not formally on the board, was as powerful as most of them. Maas wrote that organized crime was a $40 billion a year enterprise. He quoted Valachi saying the syndicate's income was so large that if taxed, it could reduce national taxes by 10% instead of raising them. For men who had thrived in silence, that kind of exposure was corrosive. Carlo Gambino had already weathered Senate hearings, strike forces, union probes, electronic surveillance, hotel room indictments, and internecine wars that threatened to drag every family into court. He had kept his profile low, allowed others to take headlines, let the word "retired" circulate. He had watched Robert Kennedy die, Martin Luther King Jr. fall, the country fracture, and believed perhaps that chaos covered everything. What he did not anticipate was that the story would be written down in plain English, packaged for Middle America, and carried into living rooms by a mass-market magazine. Not rumor. Not whispers in a hearing room. a book with names, structure, profit figures, and a commission laid out like a corporate board. By the end of 1968, bombs had exploded in Tucson, checks had been laundered through Manhattan banks, stolen treasury bills had crossed the Atlantic, union funds had been stripped, a police officer had been fired and vanished, a Gambino soldier had disappeared, and the inner workings of Cosa Nostra had become national reading material. Silence, omerta, was no longer the only language in the room. By January 1969, the people assigned to chase organized crime into New Jersey weren't walking into a fresh story. They were walking into old concrete, poured decades earlier and set hard. To understand what they were up against, they had to go backward. The rise and fall of the Longhi-Zwilman Empire in the 1930s, the 1940s, and the early 1950s. Gambling, prostitution, political reach. Then the handover, when Thomas Tommy Ryan Eboli and Gerardo Jerry. Catena pushed the Zwilmans out, and the Cosa Nostra tightened its grip until the state wasn't a territory anymore. It was a platform. Police estimates said that virtually half of New Jersey's legitimate enterprises were under mob control. Road building, heavy construction, the building trades, the waterfront, trucking, garbage and carting, the clean businesses that moved dirty money and made it look like payroll. That was the landscape. And in that landscape, health was a tactic. The funeral of the brother of Gaspar di Gregorio, an old Bonanno power, turned into a live demonstration of how quickly medical advice worked when detectives showed up. Di Gregorio had spent years producing certificates, claiming his heart couldn't take a grand jury chair. Carlo Gambino had played the same card. But at the funeral, they were both outside with the full roll call of mob royalty, shaking hands, holding court, until the uninvited faces appeared. Then the script changed. Di Gregorio suddenly needed help getting in and out. Gambino's condition worsened the moment he realized law enforcement was paying close attention. A week earlier, in Lindenhurst, the attention had been unavoidable. On Saturday, the funeral for Matteo di Gregorio, 77 years old, not classified by police as a mob figure, drew more than 800 mourners and became one of the largest turnouts of underworld leadership in the area since the death of Thomas Three-Finger Brown Lucchese in 1967. The turnout wasn't about Matteo. It was a measure of Gaspar's remaining authority and the Bonanno family's internal balance. At the top of the list were Carlo Gambino and Paul Sciacca. Gambino was described as semi-retired, his former organization now commonly referred to by law enforcement as the Agnello della Croce crime family. He was also regarded as the overseer of the Lucchese crime family, while the leadership question remained unresolved. Sciacca led the major Bonanno faction that had driven Joseph Bonanno and his son, Salvatore Bonanno, out of Long Island and seized control of New York's Bonanno rackets. Sciacca had once been a close supporter of Gaspar di Gregorio, who stepped aside in 1967 after a reported heart attack, and after Joseph Bonanno resurfaced from hiding following the mysterious 1964 kidnapping. During the 3-day wake and the funeral, the scene outside the Daniel O'Sullivan funeral home on South Wellwood Avenue was half ceremony, half surveillance operation. Suffolk detectives worked the block on foot and from unmarked cars. They photographed visitors and checked license plate numbers. 3 to 7 detectives were on duty. At all times, the building was open. They stood about a quarter block away, staying unobtrusive. Most mourners acted like they didn't notice. Some did. There were curses, obscene gestures. Gaspar di Gregorio's son, Lenny di Gregorio, was among those who went at the detectives, until older, steadier men pulled them back. The experienced figures didn't want a charge, didn't want a headline, didn't want trouble that spilled beyond the curb. Others did the opposite. They nodded, recognized the detectives from past surveillance, and acted polite, like this was all routine, like the cameras were part of the neighborhood. The funeral home itself was a practical building, white, two-story, wood frame, with entrances in the front, rear and sides. That mattered because some visitors tried to work the side doors, covering their faces and slipping in and out. Police recognized at least 20 major mob figures immediately. Then they went back to their photographs and plates, trying to identify the rest. The Di Gregorio family did things that made detectives pay closer attention. They took home the guest register every day, something police said was not normally done. They removed cards from floral tributes. Small actions, but familiar ones. Control the paper, control the names, control the chain of memory. Among those already identified, Paolo Gambino, Carlo Gambino's brother, Ettore Zappi, described as a Della Croce lieutenant, and Michael Midge Belvedere, identified as a Joseph Colombo crime family member. Police also said at least 2 members of Stefano Magaddino's Buffalo organization attended, though they were still unidentified. On Schiacca's side of the Bonanno ledger, key figures appeared as well. Nicholas De Stefano and Michael Adamo, described as lieutenants, and John Morales, identified as an underboss. The funeral mass was held at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Catholic Church on South Wellwood Avenue. Burial followed at St. Charles Cemetery in Lindenhurst, and then, outside of Long Island, the infrastructure piece kept expanding. On Staten Island, a different kind of headline ran, about ferry overloading, turnstile readings, and whether the Marine and Aviation Department could even measure how many bodies were actually stepping onto each boat. Legal capacity for the 3 Kennedy-class boats was listed as 3,180 passengers. A chart on page 10 of the Stanwyck report showed 3,639 turnstile entries tied to the 810 boat out of St. George on September 16th, and 3,591 on September 23rd. Other counts exceeded 3,500. The department said the numbers were misleading because not everyone who passed through the turnstiles took the next boat. People waited for friends, bought coffee, clustered for the following run. The commissioner admitted it plainly. Nobody really knew. Captains sometimes sounded an alarm to close the doors when they believed the vessel had reached capacity. The union representing licensed ferry officers, the Marine Engineers Beneficial Association, expressed concern in letters to Captain Ralph P. Merrill. And in the middle of that civic noise, the paper pivoted hard into something else. How the mob had been building itself on Staten Island for years, and why the bridge mattered more than any speech. The Verrazzano Bridge opened in 1964 and changed the island's value overnight. Population growth wasn't just housing and traffic, it was income. More residents meant more gambling and more loan sharking, the 2 steady engines that kept the cash moving. Increased truck traffic between New Jersey and Brooklyn meant hijacked trucks could be dumped on the island. Faster travel meant hijacked loads could be transferred and stored quickly at suspected island locations. The growth showed up in the roster. According to the article, the Gambino family presence on Staten Island increased from 5 in 1963 to 13 members. Staten Island also gained 2 members of the Genovese family, 3 from the Colombo family, and 1 from the newer New Jersey family, led by Sam de Cavalcante. The article made a point of saying not all of those figures would be identified for obvious reasons, and that law enforcement knew far more than the public ever saw in print. It referenced front businesses used to launder illegal money and properties acquired through loan shark defaults. Once a man crossed into legitimacy, the article said, there was little that could be done. He'd hit the goal. Next came respectable status. Then the story narrowed to a single Staten Island address as an example of what legitimacy looked like when it belonged to the right bloodline. Paul Castellano was described as a recent addition to the island, living at 99 Buttonwood Road, Dongan Hills, in a ranch-style house among the more affluent homes. In the organization, he carried two distinctions that mattered. He was Carlo Gambino's brother-in-law, and he was listed by the United States Bureau of Narcotics as a capo in the Gambino family. A capo regime, part of the elite ruling layer. A Justice Department source told the paper Castellano had moved up to an underboss, directly under Gambino. The article connected Castellano to P&H Rendering Company at 338 Leonard Street, Brooklyn. It said his son, Paul Castellano Jr., was associated with the Garden State Rendering Company in Bayonne, New Jersey. Despite that surface legitimacy, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics still listed Castellano as suspected of being active in narcotics. Other activities attributed to him in bureau listings included loan sharking, labor racketeering, extortion, strong-arm work, murder, and receiving stolen property. The article noted a wiretap-era code name attributed to him, Constantine. From there, it went back to the meeting that never stopped haunting every legitimate explanation. Appalachian. Castellano was among those at the high-level Cosa Nostra conference at the home of Joseph Barbara Sr. in Appalachian, New York, on November 14, 1957. Representatives from New York, Cuba, Florida, Italy, California, and New Jersey were present. State troopers led by Sergeant Edgar L. Croswell interrupted the gathering. 58 men were caught. Several escaped by jumping out windows and running into the woods, and the flight itself undercut the later claim that they were simply visiting a sick friend. The article cited Joseph Valachi's 1963 Senate testimony describing Appalachian as the National High Command of the Mafia. It mentioned Valachi's statements about topics discussed at the gathering, including the execution of Albert Anastasia, killed the previous month, while seated in a barber chair in a Manhattan hotel. It also referenced Carmine Lombardozzi and an underworld fine said to have been imposed after a commuted death sentence for violating rules in the jukebox field. Castellano was freed after serving nearly a year in prison for refusing to disclose what happened at Appalachian. After he gave an explanation, the court accepted. Another Staten Island resident, Joseph Riccobono, also called Staten Island Joe, was freed at the same time. The article described Riccobono as a 74-year-old identified by Valachi at the 1963 Senate hearings, later confirmed by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the New York City Police Department as a consigliere in the Gambino organization. It described him as a former underboss who retired after a suicide attempt on January 14, 1963. Police said the then 68-year-old garment manufacturer slashed his wrists in a room at the Commodore Hotel, severing arteries and tendons in both wrists, with an empty pill bottle found nearby. He underwent surgery and transfusions and was released. Riccobono's criminal record, as cited in Senate material, included 3 arrests and 1 conviction and suspicions of narcotics, loan sharking, and labor racketeering. The article then laid out a broad map of families as law enforcement framed them at the time. 5 bosses in New York City, with the other 4 named alongside Gambino as Vito Genovese, Joseph Colombo, Thomas Lucchese, and Joseph Bonanno. It then described New Jersey as interrelated with those 5, names Sam DeCavalcante of Kenilworth and Angelo Bruno of South Jersey, working out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It described power struggles inside the Lucchese organization after Thomas Lucchese's death on July 13, 1967, and the Bonanno family war as a life-and-death struggle between Joseph Bonanno and Paul Siaka. It said 5 mobsters were brutally executed in Brooklyn over a 5-year period. It said peace was reached after Joseph Bayonne Joe Ziccarelli of New Jersey's Hudson County was brought in as mediator in the spring of 1968. Then it returned to Staten Island's on-paper expansion, listing the Gambino figures said to be living on the island, according to addresses on file with law enforcement agencies. Joseph Lafort, 275 Jacques Avenue, New Dorp. Vincent Licastri, 12 Vista Place, Arrachar. Rocco Consalvo, 132 Tysons Lane, New Dorp. Peter Ferreira, 20 Cliff Street, Rosebank. Accursio Marinelli, 418 Atlantic Avenue, Dongan Hills. Santo Patti, 396 Seaview Avenue, Dongan Hills. It listed the Genovese presence on Staten Island as Salvatore Celembrino, 242 Sanilac Street, Midland Beach. It listed Colombo figures on Staten Island as Charles Panarella, 1297 Huguenot Avenue, Huguenot, and Greg Scarpa, 43 Marcia Place, Princes. It added that there was also a suspected member of the De Cavalcante family on Staten Island, whose identity sources refused to disclose, saying his activities were being closely checked. Then it turned fully to De Cavalcante, Simone Mary Rizzo, also known as Simone R. de Cavalcante, also known as Sam de Cavalcante, also known as Sam the Plumber, described as the newest family head in the New York metropolitan area, boss of a 62-member organization extending from New Jersey to New York, Long Island, and Connecticut. In New Jersey, the family was listed in police files as engaging in large-scale gambling, loan sharking, and labor union activity in Union County, Middlesex County, Ocean County, Mercer County, and Monmouth County, with operations strongly entrenched in Elizabeth. The article described de Cavalcante's organization as the fastest growing and most aggressive in the New York-New Jersey area, with growth beginning immediately after he took over, shortly before the death of Nick Delmore on February 2, 1964. Delmore, whose real name was Amoruso, had been cited by the Greater Miami Crime Commission in 1950 as a major link in New York, New Jersey, and Florida crime. Monmouth County didn't get a new crime problem in January of 1969. It got a rebrand. The shore had always been a place where men came down to cool off, breathe salt air, and move money where nobody expected it. Now the same machine was putting a fresh face at the front door. Police said the changeover was underway. Frank Condi, also known as Frank Cocchiaro and Frank Cocchiarella, was moving into position as the new shore boss, replacing Anthony Little Pussy Russo. Condi was described as tough and handsome, the kind of guy who could pass as a country club playboy without even trying. He lived on Howard Avenue in Ocean Township. Russo was older, heavier, and suddenly disposable. Part of Russo's trouble was that he was under conviction for perjury. The bigger problem, the one that mattered inside the life, was that he'd gotten too conservative, too cautious, without showing the hunger and enterprise that the new generation was expected to show. And worse than caution, he had become a headline. Condi's record wasn't clean. It wasn't even close. He had been convicted as a burglar, a forger, and a bookmaker. His earlier arrests and convictions were tied to New York. In 1946, he went to prison for burglary and possession of burglar tools. In 1948, he was fined $75 for bookmaking. In 1959, he was convicted of reckless driving. In 1960, he was fined $100 and jailed 30 days for forgery. In 1955, federal agents charged him with complicity in a Queens bank holdup involving $312,000, but after 5 years, the charge was dropped for lack of evidence. That was the foundation. Then he moved to Long Branch about 3 years earlier and, according to police, transformed into something else. Syndicate sophistication. The new look. Not the guy in the back room with cigar smoke and loud threats. The guy in silk suits who could hold a drink in one hand and a golf trophy in the other. In 1967, he won the Class B championship at Old Orchard Country Club in Eatontown. At the 19th hole, he stood shoulder to shoulder with businessmen and politicians, most of them portrayed as either unaware of what he really did or unwilling to ask. Police agencies described him as a mystery man on paper, no phone book listing, no directory listing. For a time, they said, he was on the payroll of Simone Sam the Plumber de Cavalcante's plumbing and heating business in Kenilworth. After that, they said, he drew pay from shore area electrical supply businesses. He looked employed. He looked local. He looked like the kind of guy who belonged at Old Orchard. But law enforcement said he was also a vicious enforcer behind the scenes, an able lieutenant to de Cavalcante, who was already established in Union County and Middlesex County, and had been branching out toward the shore. De Cavalcante's supposedly legitimate shoreline interests were described as including a marina in Seabright, real estate in Deal, and another business in Brick Township. De Cavalcante, living in Princeton Township, had been indicted the previous year for violating a federal racketeering law, accused of crossing into Pennsylvania on an extortion caper with associates from Brooklyn. He also faced a state charge of receiving a stolen pistol. The shore wasn't empty territory. It was contested space managed through truce and pressure. The Asbury Park Press story framed it as an uneasy balance after Vito Genovese went to federal prison on narcotics violations. Mob control in Monmouth County became unsteady when that happened. Gerardo Jerry Catena was described as taking over family operations when Genovese closed up his Atlantic Highlands house. At the same time, de Cavalcante edged down from the north, and Angelo Bruno pressed out from his Philadelphia base. The shore sat between them. Inside that map, Condi wasn't just a local tough with a golf swing. Police said he had shore power because he carried shore permission, de Cavalcante's backing, and because his roots traced back to Brooklyn. The article said he got his start as a soldier in the Mafia family of the late Giuseppe Profaci. For years, the Profacis kept a hunting lodge in a remote part of Millstone Township, described as a hideout during periodic wars with the Gallo Gang. Juveniles burned the lodge down a couple of years earlier, but the following year, Salvatore Profaci Jr. bought another farm in the township. The footprint stayed. Russo's footprint was different. He moved into the county around 1960, reportedly as a reward for services performed for Ruggiero Boiardo, described as a North Jersey capo in the old Genovese organization. Russo, always linked with the Genovese family, became the major mafia force at the shore, and he kept that position until he ran into the one thing the life can't tolerate: loose talk. His downfall began, the story said, when he boasted about mob activities in general, and Long Branch in particular, not realizing someone listening was going to report it to Life magazine. Even before the Life story became a public mess, he allegedly popped off to 2 Long Branch police officers and a state trooper about how he controlled Long Branch officials. A grand jury investigating the city during 1967 and 1968 called him in. Russo denied making the statements. He was indicted for perjury. After a mistrial in Monmouth County, he was convicted in Burlington County, drew a 3 to 5 year prison term, and appealed. If the conviction stood, he was going to jail. If he beat it, the article suggested, he would be retired to Florida, where he had already transferred some business interests. He was also described as suffering from a circulatory ailment and spending time in Florida. Between the illness and the reputation as a blabbermouth, he became a liability. That's what ended him. Not a war, not a hit, a decision. Condi's rise came with its own warning. Attention. The same story that celebrated his new look also said the mob doesn't like men making headlines, and that naming Condi as the next shore boss was like casting Dean Martin as Little Caesar, an image of how much organized crime cared about public perception. The point was simple. This was a management decision aimed at keeping the surface clean while the work stayed dirty. And the surface started cracking the moment Condi's name went public. On Saturday, January 18, 1969, A second Asbury Park press story said Condi was absent from his job as a salesman at Long Branch Electric Incorporated on Chelsea Avenue in Long Branch. A co-worker said he didn't keep regular hours and that salesmen weren't tied to the office. There were rumors he had moved from Howard Avenue in the Shadow Lawn section of Ocean Township, but the co-worker said as far as he knew, Condi still lived there, and added a detail that sounded like someone trying to prove normalcy. At least the month's rent had been paid, and the co-worker said he collected it. The $24,000 house on Howard Avenue was owned by J. Ronald Herman, president of Long Branch Electric. Herman wasn't at his office that day either. He was said to be in North Jersey. When the paper called his home, the listed number didn't reach him. An operator answered and said the number had been changed, and the customer instructed the telephone company not to give out the new number. She didn't know when the change was made. That's how quickly normal starts looking staged. The same story said news reports linked Condi to the Carlo Gambino Mafia family in Brooklyn, where he used to live. Herman had been quoted earlier praising Condi as dependable, charming, the kind of employee customers liked. After the reports hit, Herman was quoted saying, "They hit me, pow!" and that he had been soul-searching and didn't know what to do. Meanwhile, Ocean Township Police began checking whether Condi had been convicted of a crime within the past 10 years. If he had, he could be prosecuted under the township's criminal registration ordinance for failing to register. The machine didn't stop. It adjusted. The Daily News called it what it was. The mob, New Jersey's second government. The story opened with a wedding in Newark, where the guest list made the point without needing commentary. 3 prominent politicians toasted the newlyweds. So did Ruggiero Richie the Boot Boiardo, described as a high-level racketeer and the groom's father. So did Gerardo Jerry Catena, described as the acting director of mob operations in the Garden State, while Vito Genovese was in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Then it described a Jersey City funeral, where New York City and federal agents tried to blend into the crowd to study who showed up. They were spotted by a county political leader who ordered the police chief to get them out. Moments later, the agents were escorted back to the Holland Tunnel by police. That was the relationship the article said had crippled law enforcement in New Jersey for nearly 25 years. Politicians, police, and criminals in the same room, moving as one when outsiders appeared. According to the Daily News, since the end of World War II, aside from occasional temporary setbacks, the mob's wealth and power had steadily grown until it produced more than $6 billion a year. Statewide, from gambling, prostitution, loan sharking, and even legitimate banking. Bergen County had seen a rare campaign led by Nelson Stamler, now a judge, yielding 200 indictments and 100 convictions. Robert Minor was elected governor in 1955, partly on an anti-racketeering stand. But the paper treated those as brief flashes against a darker norm. It described New Jersey's structure as part of the problem, counties as near-independent fiefdoms, community control of police as a long-standing rule, a 1,300-man state police force without the manpower or mandate to move in, and no effective federal countermeasures. The result, it said, was corruption so extensive that none of the state's roughly 430 municipalities was considered free from taint. A veteran state investigator said payoffs began with the cop on the beat and go right up to the top of the political ladder. Ralph Salerno, described as a consultant to the President's Commission on Organized Crime, agreed that at all levels somebody is reached. Then the story shifted to what looked briefly like momentum. Governor Richard J. Hughes, near the end of his term, declared an all-out war on crime. A Mercer County grand jury was impaneled. A young Assistant State Attorney General, William J. Brennan III, was assigned from Trenton. Brennan, son of the United States Supreme Court Justice, was described as appalled by what surfaced. At a party, he said, 3, later 6, members of the New Jersey legislature were entirely too comfortable around known criminals. 2 of the named figures, Republican Assemblyman John A. Selecki and Democratic State Senator Sido L. Ridolfi, were reprimanded for associating with questionable persons by a legislative committee formed to review Brennan's claims. The committee found many allegations unsubstantiated and said Brennan had been irresponsible. He was shifted off crime investigation. But the Daily News said the message landed anyway. Organized crime infected every facet of public life in New Jersey. Attorney General Arthur Sills believed the disclosures would force the legislature to provide tools to fight back. The paper listed what had just passed: laws legalizing wiretapping and creating a statewide crime grand jury, the first in New Jersey history. The State Investigation Commission was authorized to go anywhere in the state, pursue leads, and compel witnesses to appear and testify. Sills' Organized Crime Unit, headed by 2 former United States attorneys, would coordinate the first statewide offensive. Hughes wanted more: a state division of criminal justice responsible to the Attorney General, doubling the state police force, a bill aimed at barring racketeers from acquiring legitimate businesses, and higher police salaries. Politics fought over credit. Republicans argued the recent crime laws were Republican-inspired and questioned why Democrats didn't strengthen the Attorney General when they controlled the legislature earlier. But even with the credit war, the paper quoted observers agreeing with Sills that New Jersey was the place to watch over the next 2 years for a crackdown. The Federal Justice Department opened a 12-man anti-crime strike force in Newark. And then down in Monmouth County, where the new look was supposed to keep things quiet, the headlines kept coming. On January 25, 1969, the Asbury Park Press reported the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office had opened its own investigation into Frank Condi because of the newspaper stories. Prosecutor Vincent P. Cooper said Condi's name had been mentioned during the latest grand jury investigation into organized crime in Monmouth County, though Cooper said it was his recollection Condi was not called to testify. Cooper said the inquiry underway was not a grand jury investigation, but an office probe launched since the news broke. If it produced something warranting a grand jury, Cooper said, that's where it would go. The paper also noted that around the time of the earlier grand jury investigation, local newspapers had been asked to refrain from publishing names of prospective witnesses because publishing names in advance had created difficulty issuing subpoenas. Names were floated: Frank Conti, Oakhurst, Ocean Township, as a prospective witness in earlier reporting. But the story said no one by either name appeared to testify. Cooper's office was already living inside the Russo case. Russo's perjury indictment came from the same grand jury that heard Condi's name mentioned, and the perjury charge stemmed from Russo denying he told 3 law enforcement officers he could control the Long Branch mayor and 3 councilmen. That grand jury, after a year-long probe, issued a presentment stating there was no credible evidence of criminal influence over officials or police in any Monmouth County municipality. It said there were indications of organized crime in Long Branch, but not sufficient evidence to support further indictments by that jury. That's the gap organized crime always tries to live in. Everyone sees it. Nobody can land it. One more reaction followed the Condi stories. State Senator Alfred N. Beadleston, Republican of Monmouth, was scheduled to appear before a county grand jury on Tuesday. He had been quoted saying the statewide investigations had better come into Monmouth pretty damn quick. Prosecutor Cooper asked him to explain why to a grand jury, and Beadleston agreed. Then, under pressure, he issued a statement that softened the original remark and removed the special emphasis on Monmouth County. Condi was supposed to be the new look. Russo was supposed to be the old problem. But by the 3rd week of January 1969, the Shaw succession was already dragging heat into the open. Tax liens, employment fronts, unlisted numbers, township registration ordinances, prosecutor inquiries, grand jury whispers, while the bigger state machine, the second government, was being told it was finally going to be watched statewide, wiretaps legalized, commissions empowered, strike forces assembled. And everyone involved understood the real rule. The moment your name becomes the story, you stop being an asset and start becoming a risk. Staten Island looked like a bridge. In practice, it was a pocket. It sat wedged between New Jersey and New York City, close enough to both to move anything and quiet enough to store it. Justice Department sources said nearly 1/3 of the nation's organized crime structure was concentrated in that New York-New Jersey corridor, and Staten Island sat right in the slipstream. 4 of the 7 Cosa Nostra families in the region had people on the island, men identified by government and police sources as tied to the organizations led by Carlo Gambino, Joseph Colombo, Vito Genovese, and Simone Sam the Plumber de Cavalcante. The newest name on that list was also the one authorities called the most aggressive, de Cavalcante. Federal and local investigators were watching one suspected de Cavalcante representative on Staten Island so closely they refused to publish his name, trying to prevent the kind of blowback that turns a quiet pipeline into a street fight. The reason was simple. De Cavalcante's rise wasn't slow and inherited. It was fast and organized. He went from a bookmaker in the Trenton-Princeton Township area to the head of a full-fledged 62-member Mafia family in 4 years. Nepotism gave him the opening. He was related to his predecessor, Nick Delmore. But it didn't explain the speed. He understood structure, he understood community, and he understood that the cleanest kind of power is the kind that looks like civic life. Elizabeth, New Jersey, minutes from Staten Island over the Goethals Bridge, was where he planted the flag. Right after he buried Delmore on February 2nd, 1964, out of an Elizabeth funeral home, de Cavalcante started building political affiliations through the Ribera Club, an old association founded by immigrants from Ribera, Italy. De Cavalcante admitted he was the club's director. Delmore had been closely tied to it too. The club had about 250 members and former members, and the Staten Island Advance article says that among them were employees of Elizabeth's government, the Board of Education, and even the bench. The members, the story says, were not aware of his background or why he was there. That was the point. You don't recruit with threats when you can recruit with introductions. Then the paper drops in the piece that reads like a file folder being slid across a desk. A Federal Bureau of Investigation memorandum dated March 1st, 1965, attributed to Eugene F. Martini, then the Director of Public Works for the City of Trenton, described the approach. Martini wrote that on Thursday, February 25th, 1965, a then councilman from Elizabeth named Tony Conti called to say 2 men wanted to speak with him. One was Joe Mattina, someone Martini knew from his time working in Elizabeth. The other was Sam, Simone R. de Cavalcante, whom Martini wrote he had never met before. The appointment was set for Monday morning, March 1st, at 8 o'clock. They arrived shortly after. Martini said both men closed the door behind them. Both were polite. And then de Cavalcante began talking in a very elusive sort of way, telling Martini he was known around Trenton and Elizabeth as the father, the man always willing to help. It was framed as concern, but it was an inventory. De Cavalcante told Martini he'd been approached by a small group complaining about hiring help from the outside, and specifically brought up 2 things: a sewer survey and garbage disposal. He said he would look into the situation and check Martini out in Elizabeth, where de Cavalcante's heating corporation was in the Kenilworth neighborhood. According to the same memorandum, de Cavalcante then shifted into advice that didn't sound like advice. He suggested Martini go a little slower to have a good relationship with people, and not do things or make statements in the paper that hurt people, like their boy, Peter Radice. Martini wrote that Radice was referred to repeatedly as their boy, a young bank executive whose reputation could be damaged if Martini kept talking the way he talked. The conversation widened into politics. De Cavalcante explained, in his version, why Steve Bursick lost in Elizabeth. Because he hired outsiders. He warned against the same thing happening in Trenton. Martini noted that Bursick had been defeated in 1964, and that Trenton's mayor, Arthur Holland, later lost in May 1965. When Martini tried to pin down who this small group was, De Cavalcante became vague. He said he had to leave constantly for meetings about the orphans, tied to the Ribera Club's project supporting St. Joseph's Orphanage in Ribera, Italy. Then, as if reminding Martini what kind of lineage he came from, Martini wrote that De Cavalcante let it be known his father had once been the biggest bootlegger in the area, with a big home and 7 servants. And he said, plainly, that he himself had once been the biggest numbers writer and bookmaker. And then came the line that shows how these meetings are built. De Cavalcante made sure Martini understood the approach wasn't clumsy. He told Martini he knew Martini was too smart to be bribed, and insisted that wasn't the intention. Martini wrote that the conversation lasted 2 hours, 8 o'clock to 10, and left him thoroughly confused about whether this was an approach by the Mafia, a syndicate, or a gentle hint that no further moves should be made without consultation from the right persons. But Martini had a personal instinct about what mattered most. Garbage. He believed the garbage contract had very deep feelings, deeper than just the layoff of men, and later told the reporter in 1968 that Trenton's costs were among the highest in the country. $17 a ton for city pickup to landfill. He had recommended private contractors take over work done by 45 men and 12 trucks. What seemed to annoy De Cavalcante, Martini believed, was a requirement that any contractor hire the city's 45 sanitation employees. Martini felt De Cavalcante would rather have seen his own people hired. The memo ended the way these things often end when the pressure is wrapped in manners. The meeting broke up in an extremely friendly manner, and Martini and his wife were invited to De Cavalcante's place in Princeton, New Jersey, for an Italian dinner. That was De Cavalcante's method, as described in print. Not just rackets, but social structure. Clubs, introductions, civic ties, and private advice delivered behind a closed door. On Staten Island, where investigators said 4 families already had a footprint. That kind of method meant one thing: expansion without noise. Down the shore, the same theme was playing out with different names and a cleaner suit. The Condi inquiry was no longer rumour. It was paperwork. On January 27, 1969, the Daily Register reported prosecutor Vincent P. Cooper's office was investigating Frank Condi after confusion created by aliases. 2 weeks earlier, Cooper said he had never heard of Frank Cocchiaro. Now he told the paper the office knew him as Condi. Same man, different name. Cooper said Condi had been mentioned during a grand jury investigation into organized crime the year before, but had never been called to testify. Police Chief Joseph D. Purcell Jr. in Long Branch knew him as both Cocchiaro and Condi. State police recently ticketed him for speeding in a black Lincoln Continental and for improper signaling. The summons was written to Frank Cocchiaro. Condi had lived in Long Branch before moving to 227 Howard Avenue in Ocean Township. Investigators believed he'd been selected as heir to Anthony Little Pussy Russo, who was appealing a perjury conviction, and they believed Condi operated under De Cavalcante and had affiliations with the Carlo Gambino organization in Brooklyn. The story tied the thread back to the grand jury that indicted Russo, the same grand jury where Condi's name was said to have come up. The Ocean Township house where Condi lived was owned by J. Ronald Herman, president of Long Branch Electric Incorporated. Herman told the paper Condi worked as a salesman and that he learned of Condi's New York criminal record and alleged Mafia ties from the recent newspaper coverage. Ocean Township. Police Chief Harry Harvey was running a separate check, whether Condi, under the Cocchiaro identity, had violated the township's criminal registration ordinance, He wouldn't say how long it would take. 2 days later, on January 30th, 1969, the Asbury Park Press put a finer point on what the township needed to make the registration charge stick. Ocean Township officials asked New York authorities for detailed records on a May 23, 1960, forgery arrest for Frank Cocchiaro, alias Sam Cocchiaro. The township prosecutor, Paul L. Blendon, said the record they had didn't show disposition or details. One enforcement source claimed Cocchiaro was fined $100 and jailed 30 days, lighter than what New Jersey would impose for forgery. But Blendon said the safety division reference suggested it might have been tied to a motor vehicle matter. The rule in Ocean Township was specific. Residents convicted of a crime within the past 10 years had to register. Disorderly conduct or motor vehicle offences didn't count. So the township requested an authenticated copy to determine what the forgery actually was in New York. Everything about Condi's public life was being pulled apart. His names, his address, his employment, his paper trail. And that pressure wasn't limited to New Jersey. On February 8, 1969, the Star-Gazette reported Pennsylvania's State Crime Commission had issued a statewide crime report that treated organized crime like a corporate structure. 24 geographic divisions, 5 operating in Pennsylvania, with 142 members in those 5 divisions. The commission named bosses. Angelo Bruno of Philadelphia was listed as boss of the Southeast Division. John LaRocca of McCandless Township was listed as boss of the Southwest Division. Russell Bufalino of Pittston was listed as underboss of the Northeast Division, which the commission said was headed by Carlo Gambino of New York City. The report described a national board of trustees of 9 bosses and said Bruno was one of them. It said organized crime was dominated by a monolithic organization, national in scope, feudal in makeup, directing a major crime industry. In Pennsylvania alone, the commission estimated organized crime grossed $2 billion a year from gambling, roughly comparable, the story said, to the entire state operating budget. It said only one of the 142 alleged syndicate members was in jail, despite 495 arrests among those with records. It described the primary victims as the urban poor, living in enclaves where gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics flourished and respect for law collapsed. 2 days later, February 10, 1969, the Berwick Enterprise quoted Luzerne County District Attorney Blythe Evans saying he wasn't surprised by the commission's claim that 18 members plus Bufalino were operating in Luzerne County. Evans said it was no secret, said his office had cooperated with the Justice Department and referenced names: Bufalino, Angelo Sciandra, Dominic Alaimo, James Osticchio, described as present at the 1957 Appalachian meeting, arriving in William Medico's automobile. He also noted Bufalino's long-running deportation fight and reported Bufalino had been arraigned December 16th on charges tied to transporting stolen television sets across state lines, pleading not guilty and remaining free on $10,000 bail with permission to travel if the court was notified. Put together, the picture was tightening across state lines. Staten Island wasn't just sitting between New Jersey and New York City. It was sitting between systems, De Cavalcante building influence through clubs and introductions in Elizabeth, and prosecutors down the shore trying to untangle whether the next man in Monmouth County even had to register as a criminal, while Pennsylvania commissions published charts and bosses and called the whole thing national. And the names kept overlapping: De Cavalcante in the Shore stories, De Cavalcante in the Staten Island file, Gambino in Brooklyn, Gambino in Pennsylvania, commission language. Each reference, another pin pushed into the map. February 1969 didn't arrive with a gunshot. It arrived with a hospital clock. Vito Genovese died at 2:30 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, inside the medical center for federal prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Congestive heart failure, the Justice Department said. He had been under treatment for more than 2 months, 71 years old, 15-year sentence for narcotics trafficking, the one case the government could actually make stick after a lifetime of arrests, indictments, and near misses. But nobody in that world read the cause of death first. They read the vacancy. Genovese had been moved through the federal system the way they moved all of them, shifted, transferred, broken up, so he couldn't build a power base inside any one institution. Atlanta, Leavenworth, one stop after another. The Bureau of Prisons tried to cut his lines. The lines never fully cut. Federal agents still suspected he was directing his New York division and influencing the wider structure from a cell. Even in prison, his name carried weight in the street the way it carried weight in a courtroom, not because people loved him, but because they feared what he represented. He had been the most notorious underworld figure of the 1950s. Former Governor Thomas E. Dewey once called him King of the Racketeers. The old stories around him didn't fade. They hardened. He was said to have convened the notorious meeting in Appalachian, New York, on November 14, 1957, the gathering raided by New York State Police. He was linked, in the press and in law enforcement law, to the attempted murder of Frank Costello and the killing of Albert Anastasia. Costello survived and testified he had never seen the man accused of shooting him, and that was enough to derail a case. Anastasia was gunned down in a Manhattan barbershop, and no indictment came. The pattern was always the same: smoke, certainty, and no paper trail strong enough to survive court. Genovese's real talent wasn't violence. It was control. Even the version of him that ran through North Jersey sounded like a disguise. For almost 40 years, he lived in Atlantic Highlands, commuting like a small businessman. A U-shaped ranch house valued around $20,000, a Ford, no flashy spending. Locals remembered him as a good father, parochial schools, well-behaved kids, quiet life. Then his estranged wife described a violent temper, lavish gifts, then a moment where he set her hair on fire. 2 truths at once. That was his double life. The man on the block, and the man behind the curtain. And the curtain finally dropped. The newspapers immediately started writing the next chapter, because the next chapter was the only thing that mattered. Who replaces him? And who inherits the seat he'd held on the ruling commission? The funeral was expected early the following week in Red Bank, New Jersey, at the Anderson Funeral Home. Police sources predicted a tremendous turnout, maybe the most flamboyant mob funeral in years. Other sources argued the opposite. Genovese inspired hatred and fear as much as loyalty, and that kind of leadership doesn't always draw mourners. They compared it to the July 1967 wake for Thomas Three-Finger Brown Lucchese, when an estimated 2,000 came through Massapequa over 3 days. Lucchese had been popular. Genovese had been feared. One top police expert put it in a line that sounded like an epitaph written by an enemy. Frank Costello is laughing, and Joe Valachi is smiling. Costello, who lived at 5 Barker's Road in Port Washington, had been the target of Genovese's climb in 1957. Slightly wounded, he stepped down. The seat opened. Genovese stepped in. Valachi had been a trusted man inside his orbit, until Genovese, in a federal prison in Atlanta, believed Valachi had turned informer. The kiss of death was delivered in that cage, and the message landed. Valachi decided to talk, first to federal agents, then to a Senate committee, opening the internal structure to daylight in a way it had never been opened before. Now, Valachi was serving a life term in federal prison in Texas, and Genovese was dead. So, the question wasn't whether a successor would be chosen. The question was, what kind of successor the moment demanded. In the reporting, one name rose immediately above the rest, not inside the Genovese organization, but above it, at the commission level. Carlo Gambino. Police intelligence sources said Genovese's death might trigger the selection of Carlo Gambino as chairman of the ruling commission that directed policy for 24 families across the United States and Canada. They even used the old language, capo di tutti capi, boss of bosses, because it made good copy, and because the idea was understood even when the title was disputed. Gambino, 66 years old, living at 34 Club Drive in Massapequa, was described as the leading contender. The reasoning was practical. Gambino was an elder statesman, respected, quiet. He had voting support, according to those same police sources, from Joseph Colombo in Brooklyn, Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo, Simone Sam the Plumber, De Cavalcante in Princeton, New Jersey, Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia, Raymond Patriarca in Boston, Paul Sciacca in Massapequa, and Sam Giancana in Chicago. That's a coalition, not a friendship circle. That's how these things get decided when nobody wants a war. Gambino was described as semi-retired and in poor health, but still calling the shots in his own family through Agnello della Croce as acting boss. He was also said to be advising the operations of the Thomas Lucchese family because they still hadn't agreed on a successor after Lucchese's death. Influence without the spotlight. The kind of man you put at the top when you need the temperature to drop. But putting Gambino in that chair didn't solve the more dangerous problem, the Genovese family itself. Genovese's death didn't just leave an empty office. It left a crowded room. Police sources said they were uncertain who would take control of the Genovese family's empire in New Jersey and New York, but they named 3 leading candidates: Gerardo Jerry Catena, Thomas Tommy Ryan, Eboli, and Michelle Mike Miranda. And they made sure to add one more detail that mattered. None of them ruled out a sleeper, someone quieter, less obvious, and therefore more dangerous. The experts described the structure that had been operating while Genovese was locked away. A ruling triumvirate, Eboli, Catena, Miranda, running the family for him. But even there, they leaned toward one man as the active operator. Tommy Eboli was the youngest of the 3, and one crime expert said he believed Eboli would be the man. He said Eboli had been the family's major representative at high-level conclaves, including meetings tied to the selection of Gaspar di Gregorio of Smithtown as the original successor to Joseph Bonanno, before di Gregorio retired in favor of Paul Sciacca. Eboli was described as active in narcotics, construction rackets, organized gambling, and loan sharking. He had 2 assault convictions and was appealing a Queen's contempt conviction tied to refusing to answer grand jury questions about the La Stella meeting. The detail that hung there quietly. He'd never served time in jail. That meant he still had room to maneuver without the stigma of repeated prison bids. Room Genovese no longer had. Michelle Miranda was framed as the elder statesman, family consigliere, influential, involved in jukebox operations, gambling and labor racketeering. But old and ill, not the type to make a violent play. In other words, the man everyone listens to, but not the man who walks into the fight. Jerry Catena was the New Jersey anchor, underboss, living quietly in a $60,000 home, a major power in dock racketeering and described in New Jersey investigations as a force in attempts to infiltrate state government. He had helped Eboli rule the family while Genovese was inside. In a moment like this, New Jersey mattered because New Jersey was where the money turned legitimate. And then came the warning at the bottom of the article, the part meant for the people who read between the lines. Federal and New York City police were watching Genovese Lieutenant Peter DeFeo of Manhattan. Little was known publicly about him, the report said, but he had recently emerged as a power within the family and had been seen giving orders to underlings. That's how a sleeper looks from the outside. Not a famous name, not a headline, just a man appearing in the right places, giving the right orders at the right time. So, Genovese died quietly, and the machinery didn't pause. It shifted. A commission chair suddenly looked possible. A family throne suddenly looked contested. A funeral in Red Bank threatened to become a parade or a snub, depending on who needed to be seen and who wanted to avoid being photographed. The old Atlantic Highlands disguise, the good father, the quiet commuter, was gone. And what remained was the thing that had always been real, a network that could survive the death of its most feared man because it was built to outlive him. And somewhere inside that network, the most important rule was still in force. Keep the boss in the shadows, keep the structure intact, and never make it easy for the government to point at one man and say, "There he is."